She walked into court smiling, 17 years old, charged with killing someone, and she laughed. She smiled at the judge. This 17-year-old girl just killed someone with her car, and she's sitting there grinning. Haley Cruz thought this was a joke. The victim's family sat right behind her, crying, broken. She didn't even look at them. The judge stared at her. She leaned over to her lawyer and whispered, "I'll be home by the weekend." The microphone caught every word. The victim's mother heard it. The judge heard it. She thought the rules didn't apply to her, but there was one piece of evidence she forgot about. Her own phone, still recording, capturing everything. And what the judge did next left everyone speechless. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, I'd subscribe now and tell us what you think below. 6 months earlier, on a quiet spring evening in Clearwater Heights, 17-year-old Lucas Rivera walked out of the community center with his backpack hanging off one shoulder. Inside were college brochures, homework he'd finish later, and a permission slip for a summer engineering camp his parents had finally agreed to let him attend. The sky was turning that soft shade of purple that makes everything feel peaceful, safe. Lucas had walked this route home 1,000 times, down Maple Avenue, past the corner store, across the intersection at Ridgeway and Elm. It was so routine he could do it with his eyes closed. Tonight he pulled out his phone and texted his mom while he walked. "Leaving now. Be home in 10. Don't start the movie without me." He hit send. I slipped the phone into his pocket and kept walking. He had no idea that 3 blocks away, someone was about to make a choice that would end his life and change everything. Lucas Rivera wasn't supposed to be a headline. He wasn't famous or controversial or involved in anything dangerous. He was just a kid trying to get through his junior year of high school with decent grades and maybe a scholarship to study engineering. His teachers described him as quiet but curious, the kind of student who stayed after class to ask questions nobody else thought to ask. His friends knew him as the guy who always had gum, who'd let you copy his notes if you were sick, who never made a big deal out of helping. At home, and he was the older brother who taught his little sister Marisol how to solve algebra problems and promised to buy her a new sketchbook with his next paycheck from the grocery store. He wasn't perfect, but he was loved. And on that spring evening, as he walked home under a darkening sky, he was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He was being careful. He was following the rules. He was trusting that other people would do the same. The neighborhood Lucas called home was the kind of place families saved up for. Neat lawns, basketball hoops over garage doors, chalk drawings on sidewalks that hadn't been washed away yet. The Rivera house sat on a quiet street with a fading blue front door and a wind chime his mother insisted kept bad energy away. Inside, his father was finishing up paperwork at the kitchen table. I still in his work uniform, occasionally glancing at the clock. His mother stirred a pot of soup on the stove, tasting it, adding a pinch more salt, checking her phone for the 3rd time. Marisol sprawled on the living room couch, scrolling through art videos on her tablet, half watching the streaming service menu that stayed paused on the same screen. It was the kind of ordinary, unremarkable evening that happens in a million homes every single night. The kind where nothing is supposed to go wrong. Lucas had spent the afternoon at the community center tutoring middle school kids in math. He didn't get paid for it. He just liked helping, and his college applications needed volunteer hours anyway. When the session ended, he packed up his stuff, said goodbye to the coordinator, and pushed through the double doors into the cool evening air. He adjusted his backpack, pulled his hoodie up over his head, and started the familiar walk. He passed Mrs. Chen's house with the overgrown garden. He passed the corner store where the owner always sat outside smoking and nodding at people who walked by. He passed the empty lot where kids played soccer on weekends. Every step was muscle memory, every turn automatic. He wasn't scared. Why would he be? He'd done this walk 100 times. His neighborhood was safe. The crosswalks had lights. People stopped at red lights. That's how the world was supposed to work. At the intersection of Ridgeway and Elm, Lucas slowed down like he always did. The light for pedestrians was red, so he waited on the curb, shifting his backpack to his other shoulder. A couple of cars rolled through the green light. He pulled out his phone. He's scrolling through messages from friends complaining about tomorrow's chemistry test. One of them sent a meme. Lucas smiled, typed back a laughing emoji, then looked up. The pedestrian signal turned white. The walking figure glowed bright against the dark evening sky. Lucas glanced left, then right, the way his parents had taught him since he was little. The road looked clear. He stepped off the curb and into the crosswalk, his sneakers scuffing against the painted white lines. He had the right of way. He was doing everything correctly. And for just a moment, the world felt calm and predictable, the way it always had. But 3 blocks down Ridgeway, something else was happening. A dark sports car with an aftermarket exhaust and tinted windows was accelerating, the engine growling louder as it picked up speed. Inside, a music blasted from the speakers, bass rattling the cup holders. The driver, 17-year-old Haley Cruz, held her phone up in one hand, recording herself as she drove. Her lips moved, talking to the camera, eyes flicking between the road and her own reflection on the screen. In the passenger seat, her friend laughed and shouted something encouraging. Haley grinned, the kind of grin that came from adrenaline and attention and the thrill of doing something she wasn't supposed to do. She pressed her foot down on the gas pedal. The speedometer climbed, 45, 50, 60. The light ahead of her turned yellow, then red. She didn't slow down. She didn't even hesitate. She just kept going, her voice bright and careless as she said into the camera, "Speed limits are such a joke at night." Back at the Rivera house, Lucas's mother set down her wooden spoon and checked her phone again. It had been 12 minutes since his text. Usually, he was home by now. She frowned, walked to the front window, and pulled the curtain aside, looking down the empty street. No sign of him. She told herself he probably stopped to talk to a neighbor or got distracted by something. Boys his age were always distracted. She went back to the stove, stirred the soup one more time, and called up toward the stairs. "Lucas is running late again." Her husband glanced up from his paperwork, checked the time, and shrugged. "Probably ran into someone from school," he said. Marisol didn't even look up from her tablet. It was just another normal night, the kind where you assume everything is fine because everything always has been. They had no idea that just a few blocks away, their son had already stepped into the crosswalk under a white walking signal. They had no idea that a car was barreling toward that same intersection at nearly 70 miles an hour. And they had no idea that in less than 10 seconds, their entire world was about to shatter into pieces they would never be able to put back together. Lucas made it halfway across the intersection before he heard it. The roar of an engine, too close, too loud, growing impossibly fast. He turned his head, eyes widening, his body freezing for just a fraction of a second as his brain tried to process what was happening. Bright headlights flooded his vision. There was no time to run, no time to scream. Just a split second of pure, blinding terror, and then impact. The sound was sickening, a crunch of metal and something softer. Something that shouldn't ever make that kind of noise. Lucas's body was thrown onto the hood of the car, then onto the pavement, his backpack skidding across the asphalt, notebooks and papers scattering like fallen leaves. The car's tires screeched as the driver finally hit the brakes, too late, far too late, rolling to a jerky stop 20 feet past the crosswalk. For a moment, the world went silent. And then the screaming started. The witnesses saw it happen in fragments, the way trauma breaks time into jagged pieces that don't fit together smoothly. A woman walking her dog on the sidewalk heard the engine first, that deep, aggressive rumble that made her look up instinctively. She saw the dark car blow through the red light and opened her mouth to shout a warning. But the sound caught in her throat as the impact happened right in front of her. Her dog yelped and pulled on the leash, trying to get away, but she stood frozen, hand over her mouth, unable to look away from the crumpled figure on the pavement. A man fumbling with his keys at his car door saw the body hit the windshield, watched it arc through the air, and dropped everything, his keys clattering onto the concrete. He stumbled backward, cursing, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. A teenage girl waiting at the bus stop across the street saw the whole thing through the glow of her own phone screen and started sobbing before she even understood what she'd witnessed. She would later tell police that she kept hearing the sound in her head over and over and couldn't make it stop. The sports car sat in the middle of the intersection. An engine still running, one headlight cracked, the hood dented inward where Lucas's body had struck it. Inside, there was chaos. The passenger, a girl named Sierra, was screaming, her hands pressed against her face, repeating, "Oh my God! Oh my God! We hit him! We hit him!" Haley sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead with wide eyes. But her first words weren't a cry for help or a prayer or even a panicked question. They were sharp and defensive, almost annoyed. "Why was he in the road like that?" she snapped, her voice cutting through Sierra's sobs. "He walked right out." She didn't move to get out of the car. She didn't run to check on Lucas. Instead, she looked down at her phone, still mounted on the dashboard, and reached for it, checking to see if the video had kept recording. Outside, someone pounded on her window, shouting, "You hit a kid! Get out of the car!" Only then did she slowly open the door, stepping out into the flashing chaos, looking more irritated than horrified. Within minutes, the intersection transformed into a scene of flashing lights and barked orders. The first patrol car arrived, tires squealing as it pulled up to block traffic. 2 officers jumped out, one immediately running toward Lucas's motionless body, the other toward the growing crowd of bystanders trying to get closer. The officer who reached Lucas dropped to his knees, pressing 2 fingers against the boy's neck, searching desperately for a pulse. His face tightened. He reached for his radio, voice clipped and urgent. "We need paramedics now. Pedestrian strike, severe head trauma, unresponsive." Around Lucas's head, a dark pool was spreading across the asphalt, soaking into his backpack strap, creeping toward the scattered pages of his homework. One page, a math worksheet with his name written neatly at the top, fluttered slightly in the breeze from a passing car. It was such a small, ordinary detail, and it made everything so much worse. The second officer moved toward Haley, who stood a few feet from her car, arms wrapped loosely around herself. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She looked uncomfortable, like someone stuck in a long line at the store. When the officer approached, she immediately started talking, words spilling out fast and defensive. "He just came out of nowhere," she said, gesturing toward the crosswalk. "I didn't even see him until he was right there. It's not my fault." The officer studied her face, noting the glassy eyes, the slight sway in her posture, the way her words slurred just a little at the edges. He leaned closer and caught it, that faint chemical smell on her breath, the unmistakable scent of alcohol mixed with something else. "Have you been drinking tonight?" he asked, his tone flat, professional. Haley hesitated, then shrugged. "Like 1 drink, hours ago." "I'm fine." She wasn't fine, and the officer knew it. He made a note in his notebook, underlining it twice. More witnesses started coming forward, crowding around the second officer, all of them talking at once, their voices overlapping in a frantic chorus. "She was speeding. I saw her," the woman with the dog said, her voice shaking. "She ran the red light," the man with the dropped keys added, pointing at the traffic signal still glowing red above the intersection. "She had her phone up," another voice chimed in. "I saw it. She was filming herself." The officer held up a hand, trying to get them to slow down, to give statements one at a time, but the anger and shock in their voices was palpable. They had seen a kid get thrown into the air like a broken toy, and they had seen the driver act like it was an inconvenience. One older man, his face red with fury, jabbed a finger toward Haley and shouted, "She didn't even try to stop. She wasn't even looking at the road." The officer nodded, writing everything down, knowing that these statements would matter, that they would paint a picture no defense attorney could easily erase. The paramedics arrived in a wail of sirens, their ambulance screeching to a halt near Lucas's body. 2 EMTs jumped out, medical bags in hand, moving with practiced speed. They dropped beside Lucas, immediately checking his airway, his breathing, his pulse. One of them started chest compressions, while the other prepared an oxygen mask and pulled out equipment to stabilize his head and neck. Their movements were efficient, professional, but their exchanged glances told a darker story. This wasn't a broken arm or a concussion. This was catastrophic trauma, the kind that didn't leave much room for hope. One paramedic looked up at the officer standing nearby and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was the universal signal that everyone who worked these scenes dreaded. They would do everything they could, but they already knew how this was going to end. While the paramedics worked, another officer conducted a field sobriety test on Haley, making her follow a pen with her eyes, or asking her to walk a straight line, testing her balance. She stumbled twice, blamed it on her shoes, rolled her eyes when asked to try again. "These heels are impossible," she muttered. "This is so stupid." The officer's jaw tightened. He'd seen a lot of reactions from drivers involved in serious crashes: shock, denial, hysterical guilt. But this casual annoyance, this self-centered frustration, it was something different, something colder. He finished the test, stepped back, and said quietly, "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Haley blinked, confused. "Wait, what? Why?" The officer didn't repeat himself. He just took out his handcuffs, and the metallic click echoed across the intersection as he secured them around her wrists. She protested, voice rising. "This is insane. I didn't do anything wrong." "He walked out in front of me." But the officer was already guiding her toward the patrol car, and her words dissolved into the night air, ignored by everyone except the witnesses who would never forget them. At 8:39 in the evening, under the harsh white lights inside the ambulance, one of the paramedics looked up from Lucas's still body, met his partner's eyes, and slowly shook his head. There was nothing more they could do. Lucas Rivera, 17 years old, was pronounced dead at the scene. The officer nearest the ambulance closed his notebook, took a slow breath, and walked over to his sergeant to deliver the news. The sergeant nodded grimly, then glanced toward the patrol car where Haley sat in the back seat, staring out the window with the expression that looked more like boredom than remorse. And he made a decision in that moment, the kind of decision that would ripple forward through courtrooms and news reports and family dinners. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This was a crime, and someone was going to answer for it. The intersection at Ridgeway and Elm, once just another unremarkable crosswalk in a quiet town, had become a crime scene, and the boy who never made it home had become a case file that would demand justice. 3 blocks away, Lucas's mother checked her phone for the 5th time. 15 minutes had passed since his text. She frowned, set down her spoon, and walked back to the front window, pulling the curtain aside again. The street was empty, lit only by the soft glow of porch lights and street lamps. A neighbor's cat wandered across a lawn. A car drove past slowly, music thumping from inside. But no Lucas. She felt the first flicker of worry, that tiny cold spark in her chest that every parent knows, the one that whispers something might be wrong. She tried to push it away, telling herself she was being silly, overprotective. He was 17, not 7. He was probably fine. But the worry didn't leave. It settled in deeper, wrapping around her ribs like a hand squeezing. She picked up her phone and called him. The ringtone played once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. She set the phone down, stared at it, then called out to her husband. "David, Lucas isn't answering." David looked up from his paperwork, reading glasses perched on his nose. "He's probably got his headphones in," he said, though his voice didn't sound as certain as his words. He stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out himself. Nothing. He pulled out his own phone and tried calling. Voicemail. A small knot of tension began to form in his stomach. Maybe he stopped at a friend's house, he suggested, but even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Lucas always texted if plans changed. Always. Marisol sat up on the couch, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "Is Luke okay?" she asked quietly. Her mother forced a smile. "I'm sure he's fine, baby. He probably just got distracted." But her hands were shaking as she scrolled through her contacts, looking for numbers of Lucas's friends, anyone who might have seen him. She was in the middle of typing out a text to one of his classmates when there was a knock at the door. A firm, measured knock, the kind that doesn't sound like a neighbor stopping by or a delivery driver. Everyone in the room froze. David and his wife looked at each other, and in that split second of eye contact, 1,000 terrible possibilities flashed between them. "I'll get it," David said quietly, moving toward the door. His wife followed, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Marisol stayed on the couch, clutching a pillow, suddenly very still. David opened the door, and his worst fears materialized in the form of 2 uniformed police officers standing on his porch, hats in their hands, faces carefully neutral in that way that meant they were about to deliver unbearable news. "Mr. Rivera?" one of them asked gently. David nodded, unable to speak. The officer took a breath. "Can we come inside?" They sat in the living room, the same room where Lucas had sprawled on that couch just hours ago, teasing his sister, scrolling through his phone, complaining about having too much homework. The officers spoke in low, careful tones, using words like accident and intersection and unresponsive. But the words didn't really land, not at first. They bounced off the surface of reality like stones skipping across water. Lucas's mother shook her head repeatedly, as if she could physically reject what she was hearing. "No," she said, voice tight. "No, that's not right. He was walking home. He's careful. He always looks both ways." The officer, a woman with kind eyes and a tired face, reached out and gently touched her hand. "I'm so sorry," she said. "The paramedics did everything they could, but his injuries were too severe." The words, "too severe," finally broke through. Lucas's mother made a sound, a low wail that came from somewhere deep and primal, a place where language didn't exist. David wrapped his arms around her, and they collapsed into each other, 2 people trying to hold up a world that had just crumbled beneath their feet. Marisol sat frozen on the couch, her eyes wide, her face pale. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stared at the police officers, her mind refusing to process what they were saying. Lucas couldn't be dead. Dead was something that happened to old people, or people in movies, or strangers on the news. Not big brothers. Not boys who promised to buy you sketchbooks and taught you how to factor polynomials. One of the officers knelt down in front of her, speaking gently. "Is there someone we can call for you? An aunt? An uncle? A grandparent?" Marisol didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice was trapped somewhere inside her chest, tangled up with her breath and her heartbeat and the sudden horrible understanding that her brother was never coming home, that the last time she'd seen him she hadn't even said goodbye. She'd just been scrolling through her tablet, barely looking up as he left. And now he was gone. The officers explained what would happen next. There would be an investigation. There would be an autopsy. There would be questions, statements, procedures. The driver of the car had been arrested. She was a minor, another teenager, taken into custody at the scene. Lucas's father, still holding his wife as she sobbed into his shoulder, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Who?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Who was driving?" The officer hesitated, then gave a name. Haley Cruz. It meant nothing to them. They didn't know her, had never heard Lucas mention her. She wasn't a friend or a classmate or anyone in their world. She was just a stranger who had crashed into their lives and torn them apart. David felt a surge of rage so powerful it nearly knocked him off balance. He wanted to scream, to punch a wall, to demand answers that no one could give him. But he didn't. He just sat there, holding his wife, feeling utterly helpless, as two police officers stood in his living room and explained how his son's life had been reduced to a case number and a body in the morgue. The officers left after nearly an hour, promising to stay in touch, to keep the family updated, to do everything they could to get justice for Lucas. When the door closed behind them, the house fell into a silence so thick it felt like drowning. Lucas's mother walked slowly toward the stairs, as if moving through water, and stood at the bottom looking up toward his bedroom. The door was half open. She could see the edge of his bed, the posters on his wall, the pile of laundry he'd promised to fold this weekend. She wanted to go up there, to lie down in his bed, to breathe in the smell of his shampoo and pretend he was just at school or at a friend's house. But she couldn't make herself climb the stairs. If she went into his room, it would make it real. And she wasn't ready for it to be real. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So she stood there, one hand on the railing, staring up at that half-open door, and wept for the son who would never walk through it again. Behind her, Marisol finally started to cry. Quiet sobs that shook her small shoulders, and David pulled her close, his own tears falling into her hair. At the movie they'd been waiting to watch was still paused on the screen, frozen on the same frame it had been on, when Lucas texted that he'd be home in 10 minutes. No one had the heart to turn it off. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the crash at Ridgeway and Elm had transformed from a tragedy into an active criminal investigation. Detective Aaron Malloy arrived at the station just after 6, coffee in hand, and found a thick file already waiting on her desk. She flipped it open, scanning the initial reports. Male victim, 17, deceased at scene. Female driver, also 17, arrested for suspicion of DUI and vehicular manslaughter. Multiple witnesses. Video evidence. That last detail made her pause. Video evidence. In her 15 years working these cases, she'd learned that cameras didn't lie the way people did. If there was video, it would either clear the driver or bury her. Malloy pulled the file closer and started reading every page, making notes in the margins, her detective's mind already assembling the pieces into a narrative she would eventually present in court. The first step was the blood draw. At the hospital where Haley had been taken after her arrest, a nurse had drawn her blood less than an hour after the crash, with an officer standing by to maintain the chain of custody. The vials had been labeled, sealed, and sent to the state lab for toxicology analysis. Results would take a few days, but Malloy had read the arresting officer's notes about the smell of alcohol, the glassy eyes, the failed field sobriety test. She'd seen enough DUI cases to know what those signs meant. Still, in court, signs weren't enough. And they needed numbers, they needed science, and soon they would have it. Malloy made a note to follow up with the lab to make sure the results were processed quickly. In cases like this, where public attention was already building, delays could erode trust in the system. Next, Malloy turned her attention to the physical evidence. 2 phones had been recovered from the scene, both bagged and logged. One belonged to Lucas, its screen shattered, but the device potentially salvageable. The other belonged to Haley, found still mounted to the dashboard of her car, its screen frozen on a paused video. Malloy felt a small surge of anticipation. If that video showed what she suspected it might show, it would be the prosecution's most powerful weapon. She called down to the Digital Forensics Unit, requesting priority processing on both devices. But the techs promised to have preliminary reports within 48 hours. Malloy thanked them and hung up, then sat back in her chair, staring at the crime scene photos spread across her desk. The intersection, the skid marks, the body, the shattered backpack. And in the background of one photo, barely visible, a pair of painted white lines marking the crosswalk where Lucas had every legal right to be. Witness statements were next. Malloy spent the morning interviewing everyone who had seen the crash. The woman with the dog sat across from her in the small interview room, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and described the car flying through the red light, the driver's face visible in the glow of her phone screen. "She wasn't even looking at the road," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Not until the very last second." A second witness, the man who had dropped his keys, confirmed the same thing. "That light was red for at least 3 or 4 seconds before she got there," he said firmly. "She had plenty of time to stop. She just didn't." A third witness, the teenage girl from the bus stop, added another detail. "I heard laughing," she said quietly, "from inside the car, right before it happened." Malloy wrote everything down, her pen moving quickly across the page. Consistency between witness statements was crucial, and so far, every single person was telling the same story. Later that afternoon, Malloy sat in on Haley's first formal interview. The girl had been given time to sleep, to shower, to change into a detention center jumpsuit. A guardian was present, along with a public defender who looked too young and too tired. Haley sat at the metal table, arms folded, her face set in an expression somewhere between sullen and defiant. Malloy read her rights again, just to be sure, and Haley nodded impatiently. "Yeah, I get it." The detective started with easy questions: name, age, address. Then she moved into the night of the crash. "Tell me what happened," Malloy said, her tone neutral. Haley sighed, as if this were all a huge inconvenience. "I was driving home. This guy stepped out into the road. I hit the brakes, but it was too late." Malloy made a note. "Were you using your phone?" Haley hesitated. "I mean, music was playing, and maybe I was recording a little, but just for a second." Malloy kept her expression neutral, but internally she felt a click of satisfaction. Admitting to recording while driving was a critical piece. She pressed further. "How fast were you going?" Haley shrugged. "I don't know, normal speed." Malloy glanced at her notes. "Witnesses say you were going very fast, much faster than the speed limit." Haley's face flushed. "They're wrong. People always exaggerate." The detective leaned forward slightly. "Had you been drinking?" Another hesitation. "1 drink. Earlier, I was totally fine." Malloy nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. Haley filled it, as people often did when they were nervous. "Look, I'm a good student. I have plans for college. This was just a mistake. An accident." She repeated the word accident several times, as if saying it enough would make it true. But accidents implied no fault, no choice, no responsibility. And everything Malloy had seen so far suggested this was anything but an accident. The interview continued for another 30 minutes. Haley insisted she'd hit the brakes as soon as she saw Lucas. She claimed the intersection was dark and confusing. She emphasized her age, her clean record, her good grades. She never once asked how Lucas was, even though she'd been told he was dead. She never expressed sorrow or regret for his family. Every sentence circled back to her future, to her inconvenience. Malloy had interviewed hundreds of suspects over the years, and she'd learned to read people. Some lied badly, some lied well, and some told the truth, but in a way that revealed more than they intended. Haley fell into that last category. She wasn't lying about the basic facts. So she was just utterly incapable of seeing them from any perspective other than her own. And that, Malloy knew, would be her undoing in court. When the interview ended and Haley was led back to her cell, Malloy sat alone in the interview room, reviewing her notes. She circled one phrase Haley had repeated. "I hit the brakes as soon as I saw him." That was a testable claim. Skid mark analysis, vehicle data recorders, dash cam footage, all of it could confirm or contradict that statement. Malloy gathered her files and headed back to her desk, where the collision reconstruction team's preliminary report was waiting. She opened it, scanned the technical jargon, and found what she was looking for. The skid marks began only a short distance before the point of impact. The car's event data recorder showed brake engagement less than 1 second before collision. 1 second. Not the immediate, panicked response Haley had described. The numbers didn't lie, and neither would the video. Malloy picked up her phone and called the prosecutor's office. "We've got her," she said simply, "and it's going to be airtight." 2 days after the crash, Detective Malloy sat in the dimly lit digital forensics lab, watching a technician work his magic on Haley's rose gold phone. The device had been mirrored, its data extracted and preserved according to strict legal protocols. Every text message, every photo, every app, every deleted file that could be recovered. But what Malloy cared about most was the video app, the one that had been open at the time of the crash. The technician clicked through folders, on navigating the phone's internal structure with practiced ease. "Here," he said, pointing at the screen. "Most recent video file, recorded at 8:14 p.m. on the night in question. Duration, 43 seconds. Never uploaded, still saved locally." Malloy leaned forward, her pulse quickening slightly. "Can you play it?" The technician nodded, double-clicked the file, and pressed play. What unfolded on the screen in the next 43 seconds would become the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. The video opened with a close-up of Haley's face, lit by the glow of the dashboard and streetlights passing overhead. Music blasted in the background, bass-heavy and aggressive. Haley grinned at the camera, lips moving as she talked, her words barely audible over the music at first. The technician adjusted the audio, filtering out some of the bass, and her voice became clearer. "Late-night Ridgeway run with my baby," she said, winking at the camera. "Watch this." The phone shifted slightly, angled to show the steering wheel and part of the dashboard. In the reflection of the windshield, the speedometer was visible. Malloy squinted at it. 45 miles per hour, then 50, then higher. A voice off camera, female, Sierra the passenger, shouted, "Hit 70, come on!" Haley laughed, a bright, reckless sound. "These speed limits are such a joke at night," she said. "There's literally no one out." The speedometer climbed past 60. Malloy's jaw tightened. The phone's angle shifted again, and now the road ahead was partially visible through the windshield. Streetlights blurred past. A traffic light in the distance glowed yellow, then turned red. Instead of slowing down, Haley's voice cut through the music again. "We're making this one." The engine revved. The passenger squealed, half excitement, half nervousness. The red light grew closer, filling more of the frame. Malloy held her breath. And then, at the 22-second mark, something changed. A shape appeared in the crosswalk, blurry at first, but clearly a person. The passenger's voice shifted instantly from excitement to panic. "Haley!" she started, but never finished. There was a sharp intake of breath, a half-scream cut short. Haley's voice overlapped, a startled, muffled sound that might have been a curse or a gasp. The phone jolted violently, the image whipping sideways and spinning as the device fell from its mount. The last clear sound was a sickening thump, followed by the passenger's choked sob. "We hit him! And we hit him!" Then the video cut to black. Malloy sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of what she'd just watched settle over her like a heavy blanket. The technician paused the playback, the final frame frozen on the screen, a chaotic blur of movement and darkness. "Do you need to see it again?" he asked quietly. Malloy nodded. Yes, and I need a full audio enhancement. Pull out every word that's said. Clean up the background noise as much as you can. I want to hear everything. The technician made notes on his tablet. I can have that for you by end of day tomorrow. Malloy thanked him and stood, her mind already racing ahead. This video didn't just show a tragic accident. It showed intent, recklessness, a conscious decision to ignore traffic laws while distracted and impaired. It showed Haley laughing about speed limits seconds before she killed someone. No jury in the world would watch this and see an innocent kid who made a mistake. They would see exactly what Malloy saw, a teenager who thought she was invincible, who treated public roads like her personal playground, and who paid for that arrogance with someone else's life. But the video wasn't the only digital evidence. Over the next several days, as the forensics team dug deeper into Haley's phone and social media accounts, a disturbing pattern emerged. This wasn't her first reckless driving video. Not even close. Malloy sat at her desk, scrolling through a compilation the tech team had put together. Dozens of clips, some just a few seconds long, others stretching past a minute. In one, Haley weaved through traffic on a residential street, the speedometer showing 50 in a 25 zone, her voice narrating, "Grandma, drivers need to move." In another, she blew through a school zone, laughing as a crossing guard gestured angrily at her. In a third, recorded just 2 weeks before the crash, she filmed herself racing another car down a stretch of highway at night, the speedometer pushing past 90. The captions on these videos were just as damning. "Too fast for this boring town." "Rules are for people who can't drive." "Speed demons only." Each video had comments underneath, dozens of them, mostly from friends and classmates. Most were encouraging, filled with fire emojis and laughing faces. "You're insane. I love it." "Teach me your ways." But scattered among the praise were warnings, messages from people who saw where this was heading. One comment, and from a user named Malloy later identified as a former friend, read, "Haley, seriously, you're going to hurt someone or yourself. This isn't cool anymore." Haley had replied with a string of eye-roll emojis and the words, "Chill out, Mom." Another comment, from someone who had clearly ridden with her before, said, "Never getting in a car with you again. You're actually scary." Haley's response, "Your loss." Malloy added each of these screenshots to the evidence file, knowing they would paint a picture of someone who had been repeatedly warned, repeatedly given chances to change, and who had chosen arrogance over caution every single time. The toxicology results came back on the 4th day after the crash. Malloy opened the sealed envelope from the lab, already knowing what it would say, but needing to see the numbers in black and white. Blood alcohol content 0.06%, just under the legal limit for an adult, but for a minor in their state, any detectable amount of alcohol while driving was a violation. And then, further down the page, another finding. THC metabolites detected, consistent with marijuana use within the past several hours. The combination of alcohol and marijuana, even in relatively small amounts, was known to significantly impair reaction time, judgment, and coordination, especially in inexperienced drivers. Malloy made copies of the report, highlighted the key findings, and added it to the growing mountain of evidence. Haley had claimed in her interview that she'd had one drink hours ago and was totally fine. The science said otherwise, but perhaps the most heartbreaking piece of evidence came from Lucas's phone. The screen was shattered, the device barely functional, but the forensics team managed to recover data from its internal memory. They found his final text messages, pulled up his last app usage, reconstructed his final moments through the digital footprint he'd left behind. At 8:13 p.m., Lucas had opened his messaging app and started typing a text to his mother. The message was never sent, interrupted by the crash that killed him. The recovered draft read, "Crossing now, see you in a sec." Malloy stared at those words for a long time, feeling an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with being human. He had been doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He had been careful. He had been in the right place at the right time, following the rules. And it hadn't mattered. Because someone else had decided the rules didn't apply to them. Malloy compiled everything into a comprehensive report for the prosecutor's office. The video, the social media history, the toxicology results, the witness statements, the reconstruction data, the unsent text. Each piece was powerful on its own, but together they formed an unbreakable chain of evidence. This wasn't a case that would hinge on questionable forensics or conflicting testimonies. This was a case where the defendant had documented her own recklessness, where her own words and actions would be used to prove her guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Malloy delivered the report personally, walking into the prosecutor's office and setting the thick folder on the desk. "Read it all," she said. And then tell me this girl deserves to be tried as a juvenile." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Chen, who had been handling these cases for over a decade, opened the folder and began to read. 20 minutes later, she looked up, her expression grim. "We're filing a motion to transfer this to adult court," she said. "Today." To understand why Haley Cruz sat in that courtroom smirking, why she whispered about going home by the weekend, you have to understand where she came from and what she'd learned about consequences long before she ever got behind the wheel of a car. Haley grew up in Clearwater Heights, the same town as Lucas, but in a very different part of it. While the Riveras lived in a modest neighborhood where people saved for years to afford a house, Haley's family lived in one of the newer developments on the east side, where houses had 3-car garages and neighborhood entrances with gates and security codes. Her parents had divorced when she was 12, a messy split that involved lawyers and accusations and a custody arrangement that meant Haley spent weekdays with her mother and weekends with her father. Both parents, guilty and exhausted, had learned to cope with her demands by giving in. It was easier than fighting, and Haley, smart and observant, learned quickly that tears, tantrums, or the right combination of charm and manipulation could get her almost anything she wanted. School records, later subpoenaed as part of the pre-sentencing investigation, painted a picture of a student who was intelligent but lazy, charming when she wanted something but dismissive when she didn't. Her grades fluctuated wildly depending on how much effort she felt like putting in. When she cared, she pulled A's and B's. When she didn't, she barely scraped by with C's and D's, and then her mother would show up at parent-teacher conferences, arguing that the teachers weren't engaging her properly, that Haley was bored, that the curriculum wasn't challenging enough. The grades would be quietly adjusted, extra credit offered, and Haley would learn once again that accountability was optional if you complained loudly enough. Teachers described her in careful diplomatic language. Bright but unmotivated. Socially adept but struggles with empathy. Quick to deflect responsibility. One teacher, braver than the others, I wrote in a private note that would later be unsealed. Haley has learned to weaponize her charm. She is capable of genuine kindness, but only when it serves her interests. The pattern of deflected consequences extended beyond academics. In her sophomore year, Haley had been involved in an incident where another student ended up with a sprained wrist after being pushed during what Haley called just joking around. The other student's parents wanted disciplinary action. Haley's mother showed up with a lawyer, threatened a countersuit for defamation, and the matter was quietly settled, with Haley receiving a single day of in-school suspension that she spent on her phone. The message she absorbed: push hard enough, and the system bends. Later that same year, she was caught vaping in the school bathroom, a clear violation that should have resulted in a multi-day suspension. Instead, her father showed up, made a generous donation to the school's athletic program, and Haley walked away with a warning. Again, the lesson reinforced: rules are for other people. By the time she turned 16 and got her driver's license, Haley had internalized a worldview where consequences were theoretical, something that happened to people without resources or parents willing to fight for them. Her social media presence, which would later be dissected in court, reflected that same sense of invincibility. She cultivated an image of someone edgy, fearless, above the mundane concerns of ordinary people. Her driving videos were just one part of a larger performance, a carefully curated persona of someone who lived fast and didn't apologize for it. Her followers ate it up, commenting with admiration and envy. But there were cracks in the facade, moments where the performance slipped and something uglier showed through. When another student at school posted about struggling with anxiety, Haley commented, "That's what therapy is for. Stop making it everyone else's problem." When a former friend confronted her about a borrowed item that was never returned, Haley blocked her and posted a vague status about fake people and drama. She had a small, tight circle of friends who enabled her, who laughed at her jokes and rode in her car and appeared in her videos. But outside that circle, she left a trail of burned bridges and people who had learned not to trust her. The car itself, the black sports coupe that would become a weapon on the night of the crash, had been a 17th birthday gift from her father. It was expensive, flashy, more car than any teenager needed. Haley had posted pictures of it on social media the day she got it, posing next to it with the caption, "Got my baby, watch out world." Her mother had objected to the gift, arguing that Haley wasn't responsible enough for that kind of car, but her father had overruled her, saying every kid deserves something special for their 17th birthday. Within weeks, Haley had racked up 2 speeding tickets, both of which her father paid, both of which disappeared from her record after he hired a traffic attorney. She bragged about it to friends, laughing about how easy it was to get out of tickets if you knew the right people. Once again, the system had bent around her. Once again, she walked away believing that consequences were something that happened to other, less fortunate people. But there were people in Haley's life who saw through the act, who recognized the danger she posed to herself and others. One of her former friends, a girl named Emily who had ridden with Haley several times before finally refusing, later gave a statement to investigators. "She scared me," Emily said. Not because she was a bad person, but because she genuinely didn't seem to understand that other people were real. Like she'd be going 70 in a neighborhood and I'd beg her to slow down, and she'd just laugh and say I was being dramatic. She thought it was funny. She thought she was invincible. Another classmate described a time when Haley had nearly hit a cyclist while filming a video. The guy yelled at her, and she just flipped him off and drove away. She said he shouldn't have been in the road, like it was his fault she almost killed him. These stories, collected in the weeks after the crash, formed a portrait of someone who had never been forced to truly reckon with the consequences of her actions. Until now. In the days following her arrest, as Haley sat in juvenile detention awaiting her court hearings, she maintained that same sense of detachment. Other girls in the facility, many of them there for far less serious offenses, watched her with a mixture of confusion and disgust. She didn't cry. She didn't sit quietly in the corner processing what she'd done. She complained about the food, about the uncomfortable beds, about the ugly uniforms, nay, about the other girls who she described in letters to friends as ghetto and rough. Guards overheard her conversations, her phone calls with her mother, where she insisted this was all a huge overreaction, that she'd be home soon, that her lawyer would fix everything. In one recorded call, she told her mother, "They're acting like I'm some kind of monster. It was an accident. He literally walked right in front of me. Why is everyone acting like I did it on purpose?" Her mother, desperate and grieving in her own way for the daughter she thought she knew, tried to inject some reality. "Haley, a boy is dead. His family is destroyed. You need to understand how serious this is." Haley's response caught on the recording. "I know, Mom, but my life is ruined too." That phrase, "my life is ruined too," became a refrain in her letters and calls from detention. She saw herself as a victim, another casualty of that night, her future stolen just like Lucas's had been. The difference, the crucial difference she couldn't seem to grasp, was that Lucas hadn't chosen his fate. He had been walking home, following the rules, trusting that others would do the same. Haley had made a series of deliberate choices: to drink, to smoke, to drive, to speed, to film herself, to ignore a red light. Every single one of those choices had been hers, and every single one had brought her closer to the moment of impact. But in her mind, she remained the protagonist of her own story, the misunderstood teenager being punished too harshly for a simple mistake. It was that mindset, that fundamental inability to see outside herself, that would make her courtroom behavior so shocking and her eventual sentencing so severe. Because the one thing judges, juries, and the public cannot forgive is a defendant who refuses to acknowledge the humanity of their victim. And Haley, despite every opportunity, every warning, every consequence, never learned how. The motion to transfer Haley's case from juvenile to adult court landed on Judge Daniel Klein's desk on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by a thick stack of supporting documents. The prosecutor's office had pulled out every stop, compiling the video evidence, the social media history, the toxicology results, the witness statements, and a detailed argument for why this case warranted the more serious venue. Judge Klein, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and a reputation for being fair but firm, cleared his morning schedule and read through everything carefully. He had presided over countless juvenile cases in his career, and he understood the delicate balance the law required. Recognizing that young people's brains were still developing, that they deserved opportunities for rehabilitation, while also acknowledging that some actions were so serious, so harmful, that they demanded adult consequences. This case, he realized as he read, was going to test that balance in ways that would reverberate far beyond his courtroom. The hearing on the transfer motion was scheduled for the following week. Both sides came prepared. The prosecution brought Detective Malloy, who walked the judge through the evidence step by step, explaining the speed, the intoxication, the video, the pattern of prior reckless behavior. She played portions of the Ridgeway Run video in court, and Judge Klein watched in silence, his expression unreadable. The defense brought a psychologist who had evaluated Haley, a well-meaning woman who testified about adolescent brain development, about impulsivity and peer pressure, and the capacity for change. She argued that Haley's actions, while tragic, were consistent with typical teenage risk-taking behavior, amplified by social media culture and inadequate parental supervision. "She's not a hardened criminal," the psychologist said. "She's a child who made a terrible mistake and deserves a chance at rehabilitation within the juvenile system." The prosecutor, on cross-examination, asked a single-pointed question. "In your evaluation, did you find evidence of genuine remorse or empathy for the victim?" The psychologist hesitated. She expressed regret for the situation. "That's not what I asked," the prosecutor pressed. The psychologist sighed. "No, not in the way I would have expected." Judge Klein took a recess to review his notes and consider the arguments. He sat alone in his chambers, looking at two photographs side by side on his desk. One was Lucas's school picture, provided by the prosecution, showing a smiling boy with hopeful eyes and his whole life ahead of him. The other was a still frame from Haley's video, showing her grinning at the camera seconds before the crash. He thought about the legal standards he was required to apply. Was the offense serious enough? Yes, vehicular homicide was among the most serious charges a juvenile could face. Or was there evidence of premeditation or sophistication? Not premeditation in the traditional sense, but certainly a pattern of knowing, deliberate choices. Was the defendant amenable to rehabilitation in the juvenile system? That was the harder question. The juvenile system was designed for kids who made impulsive mistakes and needed guidance. But what about kids who had been given guidance, who had been warned repeatedly, who had resources and support, and still chose recklessness? What about kids who, even after killing someone, showed more concern for their own inconvenience than for the life they'd taken? When court reconvened, Judge Klein delivered his ruling from the bench, his voice measured and clear. This court does not take lightly the decision to transfer a juvenile defendant to adult criminal court, he began. The law recognizes that young people are different, that their capacity for change and growth is significant, and that the juvenile system exists precisely to provide rehabilitation rather than purely punishment. He paused, looking directly at Haley, who sat at the defense table trying to look appropriately somber, but mostly looking impatient. However, the judge continued, this court must also consider the severity of the offense, the defendant's state of mind, and the likelihood that rehabilitation can be achieved within the juvenile system. After reviewing all the evidence, including the defendant's own recorded words and actions, this court finds that the state has met its burden. Haley's mother gasped softly. Haley herself went very still. The motion to transfer this case to adult criminal court is granted. Ms., our Cruz will be tried as an adult on all charges. The decision sent shockwaves through the community. Local news picked up the story, and suddenly Haley's face was on every screen, her smirking courtroom demeanor captured by cameras and replayed in endless loops. Online, the reaction was swift and divided. Some people applauded the decision, arguing that 17 was old enough to understand that drinking, speeding, and distracted driving could kill someone, and that Haley's lack of remorse proved she needed serious consequences. Others pushed back, citing studies on brain development, arguing that trying teenagers as adults was a failure of the justice system, that it prioritized vengeance over rehabilitation. The debate raged in comment sections, on talk radio, in coffee shops and dinner tables across town. But in the Rivera household, there was no debate. Lucas's mother, reading the news on her phone while sitting in her son's untouched bedroom, felt a small, bitter sense of relief. It wasn't joy, it wasn't satisfaction, it was just the tiniest easing of the crushing weight on her chest. Someone, somewhere, had looked at what happened to her son and said, "This matters. This deserves to be taken seriously." As the case moved forward toward trial, both sides prepared their strategies. The prosecution knew they had a strong case, but they also knew that putting a 17-year-old girl in front of a jury required careful handling. They couldn't come across as vindictive or cruel. They needed to let the evidence speak for itself, to let Haley's own words and actions paint the picture of who she was and what she'd done. The defense, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle. Their client had been caught on camera doing exactly what she was accused of, and her behavior since the crash had alienated potential sympathizers. Their best hope was to humanize her, to find character witnesses who could testify to her good qualities, to argue that one terrible night shouldn't define her entire life. They brought in teachers who remembered her volunteering at a food drive, neighbors who recalled her helping with yard work, a youth pastor who spoke about her potential. But every positive testimony was undercut by the prosecution's cross-examination, which gently but firmly reminded witnesses that they hadn't known about the drinking, the speeding, the videos, the pattern of behavior that Haley had hidden from the adults who wanted to believe in her. The trial date was set, and as it approached, Clearwater Heights seemed to hold its breath. The intersection at Ridgeway and Elm had become a makeshift memorial. Flowers and candles and stuffed animals piled against the traffic signal pole. Someone had placed a framed photo of Lucas there, his school picture protected behind glass, and people stopped to leave notes and pay their respects. The memorial grew larger each day, a physical manifestation of collective grief and anger. Across town, the Cruz family retreated behind closed doors, curtains drawn, ignoring the reporters who occasionally knocked. Haley's father hired a crisis management consultant to try to control the narrative, but there was no controlling it. The story had taken on a life of its own, fueled by the viral courtroom clips, the devastating evidence, and the universal fear that any of us could be Lucas or any of our children could be Haley. It was a story about privilege and accountability, about youth and responsibility, about what happens when someone who has never faced real consequences finally does. And everyone, it seemed, had an opinion about how it should end. While the legal machinery ground forward, while lawyers filed motions and judges made rulings, and the media chased soundbites, the Rivera family existed in a fog of grief so thick it felt like drowning. The days after Lucas's death blurred together into a nightmare that never ended, a loop of agonizing moments that repeated without mercy. Mornings were the worst, that brief window between waking and remembering when, for just a second, everything was normal. And then reality crashed back in, and Lucas's mother would lie there in bed, unable to move, the weight of his absence pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. She stopped cooking, stopped eating much of anything. The pot of soup she'd been making the night Lucas died still sat in the refrigerator, untouched, because throwing it away felt like erasing one more piece of him. His father went through the motions of daily life like a robot, going to work, coming home, sitting in front of the television without actually watching anything. Marisol stopped drawing, stopped going to school, stopped talking much at all. The house that had once been full of noise and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family life became a mausoleum. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning, the kind of day where the sky seems to mirror the collective mood of everyone beneath it. The church was packed, standing room only, with Lucas's classmates filling entire pews, many of them wearing his school's colors or carrying signs with his name. Teachers came, neighbors came, people who had only met Lucas once or twice but felt compelled to bear witness. The service was both beautiful and unbearable. A friend played guitar, stumbling through a song Lucas had been learning, crying too hard to finish. The principal gave a speech about potential and promise and the tragedy of a life cut short. Lucas's aunt read a poem that no one could quite hear through their own sobbing. And then Lucas's mother stood up to speak, and the entire church fell into a silence so complete you could hear the soft patter of rain starting outside. She walked to the podium slowly, gripping a crumpled tissue in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring out at the sea of faces, trying to find the strength to speak. When she finally did, her voice was quiet but steady, each word deliberate. "My son was 17 years old," she began. "He was going to study engineering. He wanted to build bridges, real ones, the kind that connect people and places. He had already been accepted to 2 colleges. He had plans, he had dreams, he had a future." Her voice cracked on the word future, but she kept going. "The night he died, he texted me. He said he'd be home in 10 minutes. I waited for him. I stood at the window and waited. And when the police came to my door instead, when they told me my son was gone, my first thought was that there had been a mistake. Because boys like Lucas, boys who are careful and kind and responsible, they don't just die. That's not how the world is supposed to work." She paused, wiping her eyes. But that is how it worked. Because someone else decided that rules didn't matter, that other people's lives didn't matter, that getting likes on a video was more important than the person in the crosswalk. She looked down at the closed casket in front of her, simple wood covered in white flowers. They had chosen a closed casket because the impact had been too severe, because they wanted people to remember Lucas as he was, not as he looked after Haley's car struck him. "I don't get to hug my son again," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "I don't get to see him graduate or go to college or get married or have children. I don't get to watch him build those bridges he dreamed about. Someone took all of that from him, and from me, and from his father and his sister and everyone who loved him." She gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white. The person who did this has been in court, and she smiled. She laughed. She told her lawyer she'd be home by the weekend. Like this was all just an inconvenience for her, like my son's life meant nothing. The church was so quiet that the sound of someone's stifled sob echoed like a shout. "I hope," Lucas's mother said, her voice shaking with emotion, "that when the time comes, justice is served, not for revenge, but because Lucas mattered, because every child who walks across a crosswalk deserves to make it home." After the funeral, the family gathered at the Rivera house for a reception that felt more like a wake. People filled the rooms, speaking in hushed tones, balancing paper plates of food. No one really wanted to eat. Lucas's friends clustered together in the backyard, some crying, some staring blankly, all of them grappling with the sudden violent introduction to mortality. One of his closest friends, a boy named Marcus, who had known Lucas since elementary school, approached Lucas's father and handed him something. It was a small notebook, worn at the edges, filled with Lucas's handwriting. "He let me borrow this last month," Marcus said quietly. "It's got notes for the engineering camp he was going to. I thought you might want it." Lucas's father took the notebook with trembling hands, opened it to a random page, and saw his son's neat handwriting outlining ideas for a bridge design project. He closed it quickly, unable to look any longer, and pulled Marcus into a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for being his friend." In the weeks that followed, the Riveras had to navigate not just their grief, but also the intrusive machinery of the legal system. There were meetings with prosecutors, requests for victim impact statements, questions about whether they wanted to attend the trial. Lucas's mother said yes immediately. She would be there for every single day, she decided. She would sit in that courtroom and make sure Haley Cruz and everyone else saw exactly what had been taken. His father was less certain, worried that sitting through the trial would re-traumatize them all. But he agreed to go. Marisol, only 14, was given the choice. She thought about it for days and finally said she wanted to go too. "I want her to see me," Marisol said quietly. "I want her to know Luke had a little sister, that he was real." So they prepared themselves, as much as anyone can prepare for such a thing, to sit in a courtroom and relive the worst night of their lives in excruciating detail. The prosecutor assigned to the case, Karen Chen, met with them several times to walk them through what to expect. She was gentle but honest, explaining that the defense would try to paint Haley as a troubled kid who made a mistake, that there would be testimony about her age and her potential for rehabilitation. "They're going to try to make you feel sorry for her," Chen warned, "and that's their job. But my job is to make sure the jury sees the whole picture. I'm the choices she made, the warnings she ignored, the victim she left in the street." She paused, looking at each of them. "I can't promise you a specific outcome, but I can promise you that I will fight for Lucas. I will make sure his story is told." Lucas's mother reached across the table and squeezed Chen's hand. "That's all we want," she said, "for people to know who he was and what she took from us." Chen nodded, her own eyes glistening slightly. She had been doing this job for over a decade, had sat across from dozens of grieving families. But something about the Riveras' quiet dignity, their determination to see justice done not out of vengeance, but out of love, struck her deeply. She vowed silently that she would not let them down. As the trial date approached, the Riveras did something that surprised even themselves. They started a scholarship fund in Lucas's name, using donations that had poured in from the community. The Lucas Rivera Memorial Scholarship would go to a student pursuing engineering, someone who embodied the kindness and curiosity that Lucas had shown. It wasn't about replacing him or moving on, because moving on felt impossible. It was about making sure that his name meant something beyond the tragedy, that somewhere in the world his dreams would continue through someone else. The first fundraiser, held at the community center where Lucas had tutored kids just hours before he died, raised thousands of dollars. People came, shared stories, cried together. It was painful and healing in equal measure. And for the first time since that terrible night, Lucas's mother felt something other than crushing grief. She felt purpose. She couldn't bring her son back, but she could make sure he wasn't forgotten. She could make sure that the world knew he had been here, that he had mattered, and that his life was worth infinitely more than the 43 seconds of reckless video that had ended it. The morning of the trial arrived with a crispness in the air that felt almost inappropriate, as if the weather should have acknowledged the gravity of what was about to happen. The county courthouse, an imposing brick building with tall white columns, filled early with people who had been following the case since the viral courtroom clip first exploded online. Media vans lined the street, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the building, their voices carrying the same phrases over and over. High-profile case. Teen driver. Deadly crash. Justice for Lucas. Inside, the courtroom assigned to the trial was larger than the one where Haley had first appeared, with high ceilings, wood-paneled walls, and rows of benches that filled quickly with spectators, journalists, and people who simply felt compelled to witness what would happen next. The bailiffs had to turn people away at the door. The room filled beyond capacity. Everyone wanted to see if the smirking teenager from the videos would finally face real consequences. The Rivera family arrived together, dressed in black, moving through the crowd like people walking underwater. Lucas's mother carried a small leather bag that contained his school photo, the one she'd placed at the memorial, and a folded hoodie that still smelled faintly like him. They took their seats in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, and Lucas's mother carefully arranged the photo on the bench beside her, propped against her purse where everyone could see it, where Haley would have to see it if she turned around. Across the aisle, the Cruz family sat in their own section, Haley's mother clutching a rosary, her father staring straight ahead with a face carved from stone. They looked exhausted, aged by months of stress and public scrutiny. Whatever they had expected when they raised their daughter, it wasn't this. It wasn't sitting in a courtroom watching her face charges that could put her away for decades. When the bailiff called, "All rise," everyone stood as one, the sound of shuffling feet and rustling clothing filling the room. Judge Daniel Klein entered from his chambers, black robe flowing behind him, and took his seat at the bench. And he was a man who commanded respect without demanding it, his presence calm but authoritative. He surveyed the packed courtroom, his gaze sweeping across the Rivera family, the Cruz family, the jury box that would soon hold 12 people tasked with deciding Haley's fate. "Please be seated," he said, and everyone sank back down. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The side door opened, and Haley Cruz was escorted in by 2 deputies. She wore a dark blue dress that her lawyer had carefully selected to make her look young and sympathetic, her hair pulled back in a simple style. Minimal makeup. For a moment, she looked small and scared, almost childlike. But then she glanced toward the gallery, caught sight of someone in the crowd, and her lips curved upward in the faintest hint of a smirk before she caught herself and smoothed her expression back to neutral. Judge Klein noticed. He noticed everything. He watched as Haley took her seat at the defense table, watched as she leaned toward her attorney and whispered something, watched as her eyes flicked around the room with what looked less like fear and more like curiosity. He made a mental note, adding it to the growing list of observations he'd been compiling since her first appearance in his courtroom. The charges were read aloud by the clerk, each one carrying the weight of years behind bars. Aggravated vehicular homicide, driving under the influence causing death, reckless endangerment. Haley was asked if she understood the charges. She nodded, then, prompted by her attorney, said aloud, "Yes?" Her voice was flat, bored almost, as if she were answering a teacher's question in class rather than acknowledging that she was accused of killing someone. Judge Klein's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened slightly. He asked if she understood that she had the right to a trial by jury. "Yeah," she said, then caught her lawyer's look and corrected herself. "Yes, Your Honor." The jury selection had taken 2 full days earlier that week. 12 people and 2 alternates chosen from a pool of potential jurors who had been questioned extensively about their ability to be fair, their exposure to media coverage, their feelings about teen drivers, and distracted driving. The final jury was a mix of ages and backgrounds: a retired teacher, a construction worker, a nurse, a small business owner, a college student barely older than Haley herself. They filed into the jury box now, taking their assigned seats, their faces carefully neutral as they had been instructed. They had been told not to form opinions yet, to wait until all the evidence had been presented. But it was hard not to notice the tension in the room, the way Lucas's mother gripped her son's photo, the way Haley sat at the defense table, looking anywhere but at the family behind the prosecutor. The jury had been given notebooks and pens, and several of them were already writing, recording their first impressions of a trial that would likely haunt them for years. Prosecutor Karen Chen stood to deliver her opening statement, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. She was a woman in her mid-40s with short dark hair and a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and deeply committed to the victims she represented. She walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, positioning herself where both the jury and Haley could see her clearly. "On a spring evening 6 months ago," she began, her voice clear and steady, "a 17-year-old boy named Lucas Rivera left the community center where he had been tutoring younger students. He texted his mother to let her know he'd be home in 10 minutes. He walked the same route he'd walked dozens of times before, down familiar streets in his own neighborhood. When he reached the intersection at Ridgeway and Elm, he waited for the pedestrian signal. When it turned white, when the law and every safety rule told him it was safe to cross, he stepped into the crosswalk." She paused, letting that image settle in the jurors' minds. "He never made it to the other side." Chen turned slightly, gesturing toward Haley without pointing directly at her. At the same moment Lucas was crossing that intersection, the defendant, Haley Cruz, was driving down Ridgeway in her sports car. She was driving nearly 70 miles an hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. She had alcohol in her system. She had THC in her system. And she was recording a video on her phone, a video she planned to post on social media to show her friends how fast and fearless she was. Chen's voice remained calm, but each fact landed like a hammer blow. She told her passenger, and I quote, "Speed limits are such a joke at night." When the traffic light ahead of her turned red, she didn't slow down. She said, "We're making this one," and she accelerated. She ran that red light at nearly 70 miles an hour, and she struck Lucas Rivera in the middle of the crosswalk where he had every legal right to be. The impact threw him onto her windshield and then onto the pavement, where he died from severe head trauma. The prosecutor let that sink in for a moment, watching the jurors' faces, seeing the shock and horror register. "The defense is going to tell you that this was a tragic accident," Chen continued. "They're going to tell you that the defendant is just a kid who made a mistake, that her brain isn't fully developed, that she deserves a second chance." She paused, her voice dropping slightly. "But this case isn't about one mistake. It's about a pattern of choices that the defendant made over and over again, despite warnings, despite close calls, despite every opportunity to change." We will show you videos from the defendant's own phone, videos where she brags about speeding, where she mocks traffic laws, where she films herself driving recklessly week after week. We will show you the video from the night of the crash, where her own words, recorded seconds before impact, prove that she knew exactly what she was doing. We will show you text messages and social media posts that reveal someone who believed rules didn't apply to her, that consequences were for other people. Chen walked closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror in turn. Lucas Rivera did everything right that night. He waited for the signal. He crossed in the crosswalk. He trusted that drivers would follow the law, and that trust cost him his life. The defendant had dozens of chances to make a different choice. She could have chosen not to drink, not to drive, not to speed, not to record herself while driving, not to run a red light. Any one of those choices would have saved Lucas's life. But she made every wrong choice, one after another, because she thought she was invincible, because she thought her fun, her followers, her thrill mattered more than the safety of everyone else on the road. The prosecutor's voice grew stronger. This isn't a tragedy. This is vehicular homicide, and at the end of this trial, after you've heard all the evidence, seen all the videos, and listened to all the testimony, I'm going to ask you to hold the defendant accountable for the choices she made and the life she took. Thank you. The defense attorney is a man named Robert Hastings who specialized in juvenile cases and had been brought in specifically for his reputation as someone who could humanize young defendants, stood next. He was older, with silver hair and a gentle demeanor that made him seem more like a grandfather than a lawyer. He approached the jury with a sad smile, his voice soft and empathetic. "Good morning," he began. "Everything the prosecution just told you about that night is true. A young man died. A family lost their son. That is a tragedy that no verdict, no sentence can ever undo. And my client, Haley Cruz, has to live with that for the rest of her life." He gestured toward Haley, who had been coached to look somber and was doing her best, though her expression came across more as annoyance than genuine remorse. "But this case isn't as simple as the prosecution wants you to believe. Yes, Haley made mistakes that night. She's not denying that. She drank when she shouldn't have. She was going too fast. She was distracted. Those are facts, and we're not going to hide from them." Hastings walked along the jury box, his tone conversational. "But here's what else is true. Haley Cruz is 17 years old. 17. Her brain, according to neuroscience, won't be fully developed for several more years. The part of the brain that controls impulse, that weighs consequences, that says, maybe this isn't a good idea, that part isn't finished growing yet. That's not an excuse. It's biology. It's why we have different laws for teenagers, why we don't let them vote or buy alcohol or serve on juries. Because we, as a society, recognize that young people don't think the way adults do." He paused, letting that point resonate. "The prosecution wants you to see a pattern of reckless behavior. But what I see, and what the evidence will show, is a teenager caught up in social media culture, trying to fit in, trying to impress her friends, making the same kinds of risky choices that a lot of teenagers make. Most of the time, those choices don't end in tragedy. This time, horribly tragically, they did." Hastings turned to face Haley, and she looked up at him with wide eyes, playing the role of the scared child as best she could. "Haley isn't a monster," he said. "She's a good student. She volunteers in her community. She has plans for college. She has people who love her and believe in her. You're going to hear from teachers, from neighbors, from a youth pastor, and all of whom will tell you about the Haley they know, a young woman with potential and promise who made a terrible mistake on the worst night of her life." He turned back to the jury. "The question you have to answer isn't whether what happened was tragic. It was. The question is whether a 17-year-old girl deserves to have her entire life defined by one night, one series of bad choices made with an underdeveloped brain under the influence of substances and peer pressure. The prosecution wants vengeance. They want to lock a teenager away for decades and throw away the key. But that's not justice. Justice is recognizing that people, especially young people, can change. Justice is giving someone a chance to learn from their mistakes, to make amends, to become a better person." He looked each juror in the eye. "Joyce, at the end of this trial, I'm going to ask you to hold Haley accountable, yes, but also to show mercy, because that's what justice truly means. Thank you." The opening statements complete, Judge Klein called a brief recess before testimony would begin. As people stood and stretched, the stark contrast between the two narratives hung in the air. The prosecution's story of a reckless, entitled teenager who killed someone through deliberate choices. The defense's story of a child trapped in circumstances beyond her full understanding. The jury would have to decide which story they believed. But in the front row, Lucas's mother sat with her son's photo in her lap, and she knew with absolute certainty which story was true. Because she had buried the evidence. She had held his cold hand one last time before they closed the casket. She had lived through the nightmare of a police officer at her door saying words no parent should ever hear. And she had watched, in viral clips and in this courtroom, as the girl who killed her son smiled and whispered about going home. There was no mercy in her heart for Haley Cruz. There was only a desperate, aching need for someone, anyone, to look at what had been taken from her family and say, "This matters. This was wrong. And there will be consequences." Over the next several days, the prosecution built their case piece by piece, witness by witness, exhibit by exhibit, constructing a narrative so airtight that even Haley's most sympathetic potential defenders would struggle to find cracks. The first witness called was Officer James Bradford, the patrol officer who had been first on scene the night of the crash. He took the stand in his pressed uniform, his face weathered by years of responding to accidents and emergencies, and he spoke in clear professional tones about what he had found when he arrived at Ridgeway and Elm. He described the body in the crosswalk, the shattered backpack, the blood pooling on the asphalt. He described approaching the sports car and finding the driver, Haley Cruz, standing beside it, looking annoyed rather than horrified. He recounted her first words, the ones that had been reported in witness statements. Why was he in the road like that? He walked right out. The jury listened, some taking notes, others simply staring at Haley with expressions that ranged from confusion to disgust. Under cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to suggest that Officer Bradford might have misheard or misremembered Haley's exact words, that trauma and stress can distort perception. But Bradford was unshakable. "I wrote it down in my notebook within minutes of hearing it," he said, pulling out the actual notebook and reading from his notes time-stamped to that night. Those were her exact words. I remember them clearly because they struck me as unusual. Most drivers involved in pedestrian fatalities are either in shock or hysterical. She seemed more concerned about justifying what happened than about the victim. The defense had no further questions. The damage was done. The jury had heard from a credible law enforcement officer that Haley's first instinct after killing someone was to blame the victim. It was a devastating start, and the prosecution was just getting warmed up. The second witness was Dr. Sarah Kim, the medical examiner who had performed Lucas's autopsy. Her testimony was clinical, necessarily graphic, and almost unbearably sad. She walked the jury through the injuries Lucas had sustained: severe blunt force trauma to the head, multiple fractures including his skull, ribs, and pelvis, internal bleeding, catastrophic brain damage. She explained in careful medical terms that the force of the impact at the speed the car was traveling had made survival impossible. Even if paramedics had arrived within seconds, which they did, there was no intervention that would have saved his life. The injuries were incompatible with survival. She paused, then added something that made Lucas's mother close her eyes and grip her husband's hand. Based on the nature and severity of the trauma, death would have been nearly instantaneous. He likely didn't suffer for long. It was the only small mercy in an ocean of pain, and it was cold comfort at best. Dr. Kim then addressed the question that the defense had been hinting at. Could Lucas have survived if the car had been traveling at the posted speed limit? She nodded. Absolutely. Speed is a critical factor in pedestrian collisions. At 35 miles per hour, the likelihood of a pedestrian fatality is approximately 15%. At 70 miles per hour, it jumps to nearly 90%. Additionally, at a lower speed, the driver would have had significantly more time and distance to react, potentially avoiding the collision altogether. In my professional opinion, if the defendant had been traveling at or near the legal speed limit, Lucas Rivera would most likely be alive today. The courtroom was silent. The defense attorney declined to cross-examine. What could he possibly say to refute the science? The message was clear. Haley's choice to speed had directly caused Lucas's death. It wasn't fate. It wasn't an unavoidable accident. It was a direct causal line between her actions and his death. The toxicology expert came next, a lab technician named Michael Torres, who explained in painstaking detail the results of Haley's blood draw. He walked the jury through the science of blood alcohol content, explaining that while her level of 0.06 was technically below the adult legal limit of 0.08, for a minor, any detectable amount of alcohol was illegal. And he then explained the presence of THC metabolites, which indicated recent marijuana use. The combination of alcohol and THC, even in relatively modest amounts, has been shown in studies to significantly impair reaction time, coordination, and judgment, Torres testified. Someone under the influence of both substances would have delayed perception and reaction times compared to a sober driver. The defense tried to argue that the THC could have been from days earlier, that it stays in the system long after the effects wear off, but Torres was ready. The metabolite levels and the timing of the blood draw suggest use within a few hours of the incident. Combined with witness testimony and the defendant's own statements, it's consistent with recent use. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, or the moment that had been teased in opening statements and hinted at in every news report. The prosecution queued up the Ridgeway Run video. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly, and the large monitor at the front of the room flickered to life. There was Haley's face, grinning at the camera, music blasting in the background. Her voice, young and carefree and utterly oblivious to what was about to happen. Late night Ridgeway Run with my baby. Watch this. The jury watched in silence as the speedometer climbed, as Haley laughed and declared speed limits. Such a joke, as the red light appeared in the distance, and she said, "We're making this one." They watched as the passenger's excited squeal turned to a panicked gasp as the shape of a person appeared in the crosswalk. As the video jerked and spun and cut to chaos and the horrible, sickening thump that could only be one thing. When the video ended, several jurors were visibly shaken. One woman in the back row was crying silently. Another juror stared at Haley with an expression of pure disbelief, as if trying to reconcile the laughing girl on the screen with the somber teenager at the defense table. The prosecution played the video twice more, once with enhanced audio so the jury could hear every word clearly, and once with a synchronized overlay showing the car's speed and the traffic light status at each moment. It was devastating, irrefutable evidence straight from Haley's own phone, in her own words. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing that playing the video multiple times was prejudicial and unnecessarily inflammatory. But Judge Klein overruled each objection. The video is probative of the defendant's state of mind and actions leading up to the collision. The jury is entitled to see it as many times as the prosecution deems necessary to make their case. Haley sat at the defense table, staring fixedly at her hands, refusing to watch the screen even as her own voice filled the courtroom. But the jury watched, and they didn't look away. The digital forensics expert who had extracted and analyzed the video took the stand next, explaining the technical details for the record. But more damaging than the technical testimony was what came next, a compilation of Haley's previous driving videos. The prosecution had put together a montage, a greatest hits of reckless behavior, each clip showing Haley speeding, weaving through traffic, mocking other drivers, treating public roads like her personal racetrack. Each video was date-stamped, showing a pattern that stretched back months. The captions scrolled by. Too fast for this town. Grandma drivers move. Speed demons only. The comments underneath were read aloud, including the warnings from friends telling her to stop and her dismissive, arrogant responses. Chill out, Mom. I drive better than most people on the road. If you're scared, don't ride with me. The jury saw not a one-time mistake, but a lifestyle, an identity built around the very behavior that had killed Lucas Rivera. By the time the montage ended, the defense's narrative of a good kid who made one bad choice was in tatters. The final witnesses of the prosecution's case were the eyewitnesses, and everyday people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and had seen something they would never forget. The woman with the dog, still shaky months later, described the car flying through the intersection. The man with the dropped keys confirmed the light was red, had been red for several seconds. A third witness, a teenager who had been waiting at a bus stop, testified that she had seen the glow of a phone screen inside the car just before the crash. Each one painted the same picture: a driver going far too fast, distracted, ignoring traffic signals, and a victim who had done everything right. Under cross-examination, the defense tried to poke holes in their accounts, suggesting that darkness and distance might have affected their perception, but the witnesses held firm. They knew what they had seen, and their collective testimony left no room for doubt. When the prosecution rested their case, the weight of the evidence felt almost physical, pressing down on the courtroom like a storm about to break. The defense would have their turn, but everyone in that room knew the truth. The only question left was whether mercy would temper justice or whether justice would be served cold and complete. The defense's case began the following morning, and from the moment Robert Hastings stood to call his first witness, it was clear he was fighting an uphill battle. The strategy was simple because it had to be. Humanize Haley, remind the jury she was 17, present character witnesses who could testify to her good qualities, and hope that empathy might outweigh the mountain of damning evidence. The first witness was Mrs. Patricia Chen, and a neighbor who had known the Cruz family for years. She was a kind-faced woman in her 60s who took the stand nervously, clutching her purse. Under Hastings' gentle questioning, she described Haley as a sweet girl who used to help her bring in groceries, who had mowed her lawn once when she was recovering from surgery, who always waved and smiled when they passed on the street. "She's not a bad kid," Mrs. Chen insisted. "She's made mistakes, yes, but she has a good heart." It was sincere testimony, and it painted a picture of a Haley that many in the courtroom hadn't seen. But on cross-examination, prosecutor Karen Chen, no relation, asked a single devastating question. "Mrs. Chen, were you aware that Haley regularly drove recklessly through your neighborhood, often at excessive speeds, while recording videos for social media?" The neighbor hesitated. "No, I didn't know that." The prosecutor nodded. "So the Haley you knew, the one who helped with groceries, was not the same Haley who was driving 70 miles an hour through residential areas while intoxicated and distracted." The defense objected, calling the question compound and argumentative, but the damage was done. The point was clear: people can be kind in person while still engaging in dangerous behavior elsewhere. Character witnesses could only tell part of the story, and the part they didn't know about was the part that had killed Lucas Rivera. Mrs. Chen was excused, looking troubled, and the defense moved quickly to their next witness. A high school teacher named Mr. David Ellis took the stand next, describing Haley as an intelligent student who had participated in a school food drive and helped organize a charity dance. He emphasized her potential, her bright future, the scholarships she might have earned if not for this case. "She's capable of so much good," he said earnestly. "I truly believe she can turn her life around if given the chance." Again, the testimony was genuine, but again, the cross-examination cut through it like a knife. "Mr. Ellis, Did Haley ever mention to you that she had received multiple speeding tickets? The teacher shook his head. No. Did she tell you that she regularly posted videos of herself driving recklessly? No. Did she ever express to you any concern about the risks her behavior posed to others? Not that I recall. The prosecutor paused. So you're testifying about a version of Haley that she chose to show you, not the complete person she actually was? The defense objected again, but Judge Klein allowed the question with a slight modification. The teacher admitted quietly, I suppose I only knew what she wanted me to know. The youth pastor, Reverend Michael Harris, was next. He was a young man, earnest and emotional, and he spoke passionately about redemption and second chances. He described Haley attending youth group occasionally, participating in a mission trip to help build houses in a neighboring state. The Haley I know cares about people, he said. She made a terrible mistake, but I believe in my heart that she is capable of change, and that God has a plan for her life that doesn't end in a prison cell. It was the kind of testimony that might have swayed a jury in a different case, but here, with the video evidence and the eyewitness accounts still fresh in everyone's minds, it felt hollow. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brief. Reverend Harris, do you believe that faith without works is dead? He nodded, confused. Yes, James chapter 2. And would you agree that true repentance requires not just words but a genuine change of heart? Of course. Have you seen evidence of that genuine change of heart in the defendant? The Reverend hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Haley. I believe it's possible. That's not what I asked. Have you seen it? A longer pause. I hope so. It wasn't the ringing endorsement the defense had hoped for. The psychological expert was the defense's most important witness, their best chance to introduce the science of adolescent brain development and argue that Haley shouldn't be judged by adult standards. Dr. Leonard Pritchard was a respected developmental psychologist who had testified in dozens of juvenile cases. He explained in accessible terms how the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term thinking, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. He cited studies showing that teenagers are more susceptible to peer pressure, more likely to take risks, less able to fully grasp consequences. 17-year-olds literally do not think the way adults think, he explained. Their brains are wired differently. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does provide crucial context for understanding why young people make poor choices. The defense leaned heavily into this testimony, asking Dr. Pritchard to explain how social media culture might amplify typical teenage risk-taking, how substances like alcohol and marijuana further impair judgment in developing brains. It was compelling science-based testimony that gave the jury a framework for viewing Haley as a child rather than a criminal. But the prosecution had done their homework. Karen Chen approached Dr. Pritchard with a stack of research papers in hand. Dr. Pritchard, you've testified that teenage brains are still developing. Does that mean teenagers are incapable of understanding that drinking and driving is dangerous? He shook his head. No, they can understand that intellectually. Can they understand that speeding significantly increases the risk of crashes? Yes. Can they understand that running a red light might result in hitting someone? Generally, yes. The prosecutor continued. So while their impulse control might be weaker, their basic understanding of cause and effect, of dangerous versus safe behavior, is intact? Dr. Pritchard shifted uncomfortably. That's a simplification, but broadly speaking, yes. Chen pressed further. Doctor, you mentioned peer pressure, but in the video we've all seen, who was pressuring the defendant to run that red light? Her passenger was actually screaming her name in fear. So where was the peer pressure in that specific moment? The psychologist hesitated. The broader social media culture creates pressure to create content, to show off. But in the actual seconds before she killed Lucas Rivera, she was making her own choices, wasn't she? A long pause. Yes? The defense had one more card to play, and it was a risky one. They called Haley's mother, Sandra Cruz, to the stand. She was a broken woman, aged by months of stress, her face drawn and pale. She testified through tears about Haley's childhood, about the divorce that had torn the family apart, about trying her best to raise a daughter while working full-time. She described Haley as a loving child who had struggled with the family changes, who had perhaps acted out for attention, who had made mistakes but didn't deserve to lose her entire future. "She's my baby," Sandra sobbed. "I know what she did was wrong. I know a boy is dead, and I'm so sorry for that family. But she's still my daughter. She's still just 17. Please don't take her away forever." It was raw, genuine emotion, and several jurors looked visibly moved. But then came the cross-examination, and it was brutal in its gentleness. "Mrs. Cruz," the prosecutor began softly, "did you know your daughter was drinking?" Sandra shook her head. "Did you know she was using marijuana?" Another head shake. "Did you know she had received multiple speeding tickets?" A whispered no. "Did you know she was recording dangerous driving videos and posting them online?" "I didn't pay attention to her social media that closely." The prosecutor paused, letting that admission hang in the air. "Mrs. Cruz, you've testified that you tried your best, and I believe you. But wouldn't you agree that there were signs, warning signs, that something was wrong? I have friends who stopped coming around, teachers who expressed concerns, the tickets your ex-husband paid to make disappear." Sandra was crying harder now. "I thought she was just being a teenager. I thought she'd grow out of it." Chen's voice remained gentle but firm. "And while you waited for her to grow out of it, while you hoped she'd change on her own, she got behind the wheel, intoxicated and distracted, and killed someone's son. Someone who didn't get the chance to grow out of anything." The defense objected, calling the question unfair and designed to inflame rather than illuminate, and Judge Klein sustained it. But the point had been made. Good intentions weren't enough. Hoping for change wasn't the same as enforcing consequences. Sandra was excused, and she practically fled the witness stand, collapsing into her ex-husband's arms in the gallery. The defense had no further witnesses. They had tried to paint a picture of a redeemable teenager, a good kid caught up in circumstances beyond her full comprehension, a daughter still worthy of love and mercy. But every character witness had been forced to admit they hadn't known the full Haley. Every expert had conceded that brain development didn't eliminate basic moral understanding. And every emotional appeal had been weighed against the cold, irrefutable fact that Lucas Rivera was dead because Haley Cruz had made a series of deliberate, reckless choices. The defense rested, and it felt less like a conclusion and more like a surrender. The most anticipated moment of the entire trial had been whether Haley herself would take the stand. Legal experts debated it on news programs. Would her attorney risk putting her in front of the jury, where her lack of genuine remorse might be exposed under cross-examination? Or would her silence be interpreted as cowardice, as an unwillingness to face what she'd done? In the end, the decision was made to keep her off the stand. The risks were too high. Hastings knew that his client, despite weeks of coaching, couldn't credibly express the kind of deep, soul-searching remorse that might sway a jury. She could say the words, but she couldn't feel them, and a jury would see through it in seconds. So Haley sat at the defense table throughout the trial, silent except for her whispered conversations with her attorney, and the jury never heard her voice except through the videos that had already condemned her. It was a strategic choice, but it left a void. As the prosecution got to define who Haley was through her actions and her words captured on camera, the defense never got to offer an alternative narrative from her own mouth because they knew that mouth would only make things worse. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following day, giving both sides time to prepare their final appeals to the jury. That night, the Rivera family sat together in their living room, exhausted and emotionally drained from days of testimony. "Do you think they believed us?" Marisol asked quietly. "Do you think they'll find her guilty?" Lucas's father put his arm around her. "I think they heard the truth," he said, "and I have to believe that truth matters." Lucas's mother sat silently, staring at the photo of her son that she'd carried to court every single day. She didn't know what the jury would decide. She didn't know if justice would be served or if Haley's age and the defense's arguments about brain development would result in a lesser conviction, a lighter sentence. All she knew was that she had sat through every minute of testimony, looked Haley in the eye every single day, and made sure that her son's name, his face, his humanity, was present in that courtroom. Whatever happened next, Lucas would not be just a case number or a footnote. He would be remembered, and Haley would have to carry the weight of what she'd done, whether the law held her fully accountable or not. Closing arguments began the next morning, and the courtroom was even more packed than it had been on opening day. Word had spread that the trial was reaching its conclusion, and then people who had been following the case online now fought for seats, hoping to be present for the moment when 12 strangers would decide Haley Cruz's fate. Prosecutor Karen Chen went first, and she wasted no time reminding the jury of exactly what they'd seen and heard over the past week. "You've watched a video of the defendant laughing about breaking the law seconds before she killed someone," Chen began, her voice steady and strong. "You've heard her own words. Speed limits are such a joke. You've seen evidence of a pattern of reckless behavior stretching back months. You've heard from the medical examiner that Lucas Rivera would be alive today if she had been driving the speed limit. You've heard from toxicology experts that she was under the influence of alcohol and marijuana. You've heard from eyewitnesses who saw her run a red light at nearly 70 miles an hour. This isn't a complicated case. This is a case where the defendant documented her own guilt." Chen walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "The defense wants you to feel sorry for Haley Cruz because she's 17. And yes, she is 17. So was Lucas Rivera. He was 17 when he walked across that crosswalk, following the law, trusting that drivers would stop at red lights. His age didn't protect him. His youth didn't save his life. So why should her age protect her from accountability?" She paused, letting the question hang. Brain development is real. Teenagers do think differently than adults. But 17-year-olds know that drinking and driving is dangerous. They know that speeding kills. They know that red lights mean stop. The defendant knew all of that, and she chose to ignore it. Not once, but over and over and over again. This wasn't an accident. This was inevitable. It was the predictable result of someone who thought rules didn't apply to her, that consequences were for other people. Chen's voice rose slightly. And even after she killed someone, even after she was arrested and charged, what was her response? Did she break down with remorse? Did she express genuine sorrow for the Rivera family? No. She smirked in court. She whispered that she'd be home by the weekend. She wrote letters from detention complaining about the food and the other inmates, never once mentioning the boy she killed. The prosecutor moved to stand near the Rivera family, not pointing at them, but making their presence impossible to ignore. Lucas Rivera was a real person. He had dreams, plans, people who loved him. He was walking home to watch a movie with his family. That's all he was doing, walking home. And the defendant took that from him. She took his future, his potential, every birthday and graduation and moment of joy he would have experienced. She took him from his parents, from his little sister, who will never have her big brother at her wedding or cheering her on or teaching her things the way big brothers do. Chen's voice softened but remained firm. The defense wants mercy. They want you to think about the defendant's future. but I'm asking you to think about Lucas's future, the one he'll never have, the engineering degree he'll never earn, the bridges he'll never build, the family he'll never raise. All of that is gone because the defendant decided her social media video was more important than his life. Chen returned to the center of the courtroom. You've been given a tremendous responsibility. You have to decide whether the defendant is guilty of the charges against her. And I submit to you that the evidence makes that decision straightforward. She drove under the influence. That's not in dispute. She drove recklessly at nearly twice the speed limit. That's not in dispute. She ran a red light and struck a pedestrian in a crosswalk, killing him. That's not in dispute. Those facts meet every element of aggravated vehicular homicide, DUI causing death, and reckless endangerment. Your job isn't to feel sorry for anyone. Your job is to look at the facts and apply the law. And when you do that, there's only one possible verdict: guilty on all counts. Thank you. She took her seat, and the weight of her words settled over the jury like a heavy blanket. Defense attorney Robert Hastings stood, and his approach was markedly different. His voice was gentle, almost pleading. Ladies and gentlemen, no one is disputing that a tragedy occurred. No one is saying Lucas Rivera deserved what happened to him. He didn't. He was an innocent victim, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And my heart breaks for his family. Truly. He gestured toward the Riveras with genuine sympathy. But this case isn't about whether what happened was tragic. It's about whether Haley Cruz, a 17-year-old girl, should be convicted as an adult of charges that will send her to prison for decades. And I'm asking you to consider carefully what that means. Hastings walked closer to the jury. The prosecution wants you to believe that Haley is a monster, someone who doesn't care about human life, someone who laughed her way through killing a person. But that's not who she is. She's a scared kid who made terrible choices and now has to live with consequences she didn't fully understand when she made them. Hastings reminded the jury of Dr. Pritchard's testimony about brain development, about the science showing that teenagers literally cannot process long-term consequences the way adults can. Haley didn't wake up that morning planning to kill anyone. She didn't get in her car thinking, "I'm going to take someone's life today." She made a series of bad decisions, each one building on the last, in a state where her judgment was already impaired by substances and by an adolescent brain that doesn't work the same way yours or mine does. He paused. Does that excuse what happened? No, but it explains it, and explanation matters when we're deciding how to hold someone accountable. Hastings pointed out that Haley had no prior criminal record, that she had never been in trouble with the law before this. Yes, she got speeding tickets. Lots of teenagers do. Yes, she posted reckless videos. Lots of teenagers do that too in this social media age. It's stupid, it's dangerous, but it's also unfortunately common. What's not common is for those choices to result in tragedy. And that's what this was. A tragedy. A horrible, life-altering tragedy for everyone involved, including Haley. The defense attorney's voice grew more emotional. If you convict her as an adult, you're saying that a 17-year-old should be treated the same as a 30-year-old, a 50-year-old. You're saying that her youth, her potential for growth and change, doesn't matter. You're saying that she deserves to spend the best years of her life, maybe all of her life, locked in a cage. Is that really justice? Or is that vengeance? He looked at each juror. I'm not asking you to let her off. I'm not asking you to ignore what she did. I'm asking you to see her as a whole person, not just the worst moment of her life. I'm asking you to remember that people can change, especially young people. I'm asking you to consider whether destroying her life will somehow bring Lucas back, and when you realize it won't, to ask yourselves what purpose that destruction serves. Hastings' closing was shorter than the prosecution's, and it lacked the fire and certainty of Chen's argument, but it was heartfelt. Please consider mercy. Consider redemption. Consider that the girl sitting at that table is someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone with a future worth saving. Thank you." Judge Klein gave the jury their instructions, walking them through the legal elements of each charge, explaining the burden of proof, reminding them that emotion couldn't override evidence. He explained that they must consider each charge separately and reach a unanimous verdict on each one. Then he sent them to deliberate, and the waiting began. The jury was out for hours, then a full day, then into a second day. People speculated about what the delay meant. Was there a holdout? Was someone arguing for acquittal or a lesser charge? The Rivera family waited in a private room the court had provided, barely eating, barely speaking, just existing in a state of suspended animation where every footstep in the hallway might be the bailiff coming to tell them a verdict had been reached. Haley waited in a holding cell, her confidence from earlier in the trial beginning to crack as the hours stretched on. She had expected a quick acquittal, or at worst a quick conviction on a lesser charge. The length of the deliberation suggested the jury was taking this seriously, considering everything, and that uncertainty terrified her. Finally, on the afternoon of the second day, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone scrambled back to the courtroom, filling the seats in a tense rush. The Rivera family took their positions in the front row, Lucas's mother clutching his photo so tightly her knuckles were white. The Cruz family sat across the aisle, Sandra's face blotchy from crying, her ex-husband staring straight ahead with hollow eyes. Haley was brought in, and for the first time since the trial began, she looked genuinely scared. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling slightly as the deputies removed her handcuffs. The jury filed in, and every person in that courtroom tried to read their faces, searching for some hint of what they'd decided. But the jurors had been well trained. Their expressions gave nothing away. Judge Klein asked the foreperson, a middle-aged man in a blue shirt, if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Please hand the verdict forms to the bailiff." The wait while the bailiff walked the forms from the jury box to the bench felt like an eternity. Judge Klein reviewed each form silently, his face impassive, then handed them to the clerk. "The defendant will please rise," he said. Haley stood on shaking legs, her attorney standing beside her with a hand on her shoulder. The clerk, a woman who had done this hundreds of times but still felt the weight of the moment, began to read. In the matter of the state versus Haley Cruz, on the charge of aggravated vehicular homicide, we the jury find the defendant. She paused, just for a heartbeat, and in that pause the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Guilty! A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Haley's knees buckled slightly, and her attorney caught her arm. Lucas's mother let out a choked sob and pressed her face into her husband's shoulder. The clerk continued. On the charge of driving under the influence causing death, we find the defendant guilty. Another wave of reaction. On the charge of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 3 times, the word that Haley had convinced herself she'd never hear. 3 times the jury had looked at the evidence and decided that her youth, her potential, her attorney's pleas for mercy didn't outweigh what she had done. Judge Klein, as required by law, polled the jury individually, asking each one to confirm that this was their verdict. 12 times, 12 different voices, all said the same word: yes. With each confirmation, the reality sank deeper. If this wasn't a mistake or a procedural error or something that could be appealed away. This was final. The jury had spoken. Haley Cruz had been found guilty of killing Lucas Rivera, and now all that remained was to determine how many years of her life she would spend paying for it. Judge Klein thanked the jury for their service and informed them that sentencing would be scheduled after a pre-sentence investigation. He ordered that Haley be remanded into custody pending that hearing. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists once more, and this time there was no smirk, no whispered confidence about going home. There were just tears, finally, streaming down her face as the weight of consequences she'd avoided her entire life came crashing down all at once. The weeks between verdict and sentencing stretched like an eternity for everyone involved. For Haley, locked in the county jail's adult section now that she'd been convicted as an adult, the days blurred together in a fog of regret, fear, and a dawning realization that her life would never be what she'd planned. She spent hours lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision that had led her here. The drink she'd had that night, the choice to get behind the wheel, the decision to film herself, to speed, to run that red light. Each choice had felt inconsequential in the moment, just another night, just another video. Now they had become the defining moments of her life, the choices that would determine whether she saw freedom again before middle age. Other inmates gave her a wide berth. Word had spread about what she'd done, and even among people who had made their own serious mistakes, killing someone while filming yourself speeding was viewed with particular contempt. Haley was isolated, alone with her thoughts and the slow, crushing understanding of what accountability actually meant. The pre-sentence investigation was thorough and invasive. Probation officers interviewed everyone who had ever known Haley, digging into her childhood, her school records, her social relationships, her family dynamics. They compiled psychological evaluations, analyzed her behavior in detention, reviewed every text message and social media post. The resulting report was hundreds of pages long, and it painted a picture of a girl who had been given every advantage but had learned all the wrong lessons. Loving but guilt-ridden parents who gave in rather than enforced boundaries. A school system that prioritized image over accountability. A social circle that encouraged recklessness and rewarded bravado. A justice system that had let her off easy for tickets and violations, teaching her that consequences were negotiable. The report didn't excuse her actions, but it provided context, showing how a series of small failures by the adults in her life had contributed to a teenager who believed she was untouchable. Until she wasn't. The report also noted, with clinical detachment, that Haley's expressions of remorse in detention seemed focused primarily on her own situation rather than on the harm she'd caused. Suggesting limited empathy development and a continued pattern of self-centered thinking. For the Rivera family, the waiting was its own kind of torture. They had gotten the guilty verdict they desperately needed. The acknowledgement that what happened to Lucas was a crime, not just a tragic accident. But a verdict without a sentence felt incomplete, like a story that ended mid-chapter. They needed to know that Haley would be held truly accountable, that the years she served would reflect the value of the life she'd taken. Lucas's mother spent the waiting period working with the victim's advocate to prepare her impact statement for the sentencing hearing. She wrote draft after draft, trying to capture in words the enormity of what had been stolen from their family. How do you quantify a son? How do you explain to strangers the specific timbre of his laugh, the way he'd always hug you just a second longer than necessary, the dreams he'd had that would now never materialize? She filled pages with memories and grief, then tore them up because they didn't feel adequate. Nothing felt adequate to the task of making people understand. Lucas's father dealt with his grief differently, throwing himself into the scholarship fund they'd created. Planning fundraisers, reaching out to engineering programs at local colleges, ensuring that Lucas's name would be associated with opportunity and potential rather than just tragedy. It was the only way he could survive the waiting, by doing something, anything, that felt productive. Marisol, meanwhile, struggled through her days at school, where classmates either avoided her out of awkwardness or bombarded her with questions about the trial. She felt like a ghost, present but not really there, going through motions of normalcy in a world that no longer made sense. Her grades, once solid, began to slip. Her teachers' understanding gave her extensions and extra support. But how do you focus on algebra when your brother is dead, and the person who killed him is waiting to learn if she'll spend decades in prison or somehow get a lighter sentence? The waiting period was, in many ways, harder than the trial itself, because at least during the trial there was motion, progress, a sense that things were moving toward resolution. Community reaction to the guilty verdict had been swift and largely satisfied. The viral clips of Haley smirking in court were shared again, but now with captions that celebrated the jury's decision. Justice served. She finally stopped smiling. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. But there were dissenting voices too, people who argued that sending a teenager to adult prison for decades was itself a moral failure, that the justice system should prioritize rehabilitation over punishment. Online debates raged. Think pieces were published. Legal experts weighed in on whether the verdict was fair or too harsh. Some pointed to studies showing that teenage brains are still developing, that capacity for change is highest in young people, that locking them away throws away potential. Others countered that Lucas's developing brain didn't protect him, that some actions are so serious they demand serious consequences regardless of age, that accountability matters more than age. The Rivera family tried to ignore the noise, the strangers debating their son's life like it was an academic exercise. But sometimes, late at night, Lucas's mother would read the comments defending Haley, and she would feel a rage so intense it frightened her. Judge Klein, in his chambers, reviewed the pre-sentence report carefully. He had been on the bench for over 20 years, had sentenced countless defendants, from first-time offenders to career criminals. But juvenile cases, especially those transferred to adult court, always weighed on him differently. The law gave him wide discretion in sentencing, but it also required him to consider specific factors: the severity of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, the likelihood of rehabilitation, the need to protect the public, the impact on the victim's family. He read through the report's findings, noting the pattern of escalating recklessness, the lack of genuine remorse, the continued self-focus even after conviction. He reviewed the victim impact statements that had been filed in advance, reading Lucas's mother's words about the empty chair at their dinner table, about anniversaries and birthdays that would now be marked by absence. He looked at the sentencing guidelines, which provided a range based on the charges and circumstances. For aggravated vehicular homicide in their state, with the aggravating factors present in this case, the sentence could range from 15 to 30 years, with additional time for the other charges. Judge Klein also reviewed legal precedents, cases involving similar fact patterns, looking at what other judges had done when faced with teenage defendants convicted of vehicular homicide. The sentences varied widely, influenced by factors like remorse, criminal history, and the specific circumstances of each case. Some teens had received relatively lenient sentences, 8 or 10 years, especially when they showed genuine remorse and had no prior record. Others had been sentenced more harshly, particularly when the crime involved alcohol, excessive speed, and evidence of a pattern of reckless behavior. Haley's case had all those aggravating factors, plus the unique element of her having filmed herself mocking traffic laws seconds before the crash, and her post-arrest behavior that suggested she still didn't fully grasp what she'd done. The judge made notes in the margins of the report, circling key phrases, drawing connections between different pieces of information. He knew that whatever sentence he imposed would be scrutinized, analyzed, probably appealed. But more than that, he knew that his words and his decision would either bring some measure of closure to a grieving family or would leave them feeling that justice had failed them once again. The night before the sentencing hearing, neither Haley nor the Rivera family slept much. Haley lay in her cell, counting ceiling tiles, wondering if the judge would show mercy, if her age would matter, if somehow the sentence would be lighter than the maximum. Her attorney had warned her to prepare for the worst, but hope for something better. He'd told her the judge was known for being fair but firm, that her behavior in court hadn't helped her, that the video evidence was so damning that leniency seemed unlikely. But Haley, even now, clung to the hope that something would save her, that the judge would see her as a kid who'd made a mistake rather than as the monster the prosecution had painted. Across town, Lucas's mother sat at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, reading through her impact statement one final time, tears falling onto the pages. His father sat beside her, hand covering hers, both of them drawing strength from each other because there was nowhere else to get it. And Mary Saul, in her room upstairs, looked at a photo on her phone of her and Lucas from 2 years ago, both of them making silly faces, both of them alive and together, and unaware that time was finite. Tomorrow, she would look the person who took him away directly in the eye and tell her what that loss meant. Tomorrow, a judge would speak words that couldn't be taken back. Tomorrow, one way or another, this chapter would end. The courtroom on sentencing day felt different than it had during the trial, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Every seat was filled an hour before the scheduled start time, with people lining the back wall and spilling into the hallway outside. News cameras clustered at the entrance, reporters updating their viewers on what to expect. The verdict had been covered extensively, but this, the sentencing, was what everyone had been waiting for. This was the moment when Haley Cruz would learn exactly what the rest of her life would look like. So whether she'd walk free someday while still young enough to build something new, or whether she'd spend decades behind bars, emerging middle-aged if she emerged at all. The air in the courtroom crackled with anticipation and tension, a collective holding of breath. The Rivera family arrived early and took their familiar spots in the front row, Lucas's photo once again positioned where everyone could see it. Lucas's mother wore all black, her face composed, but her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. His father sat ramrod straight beside her, jaw clenched, hands folded tightly in his lap. Marisol, now 15, sat between them, looking smaller than she had months ago, as if grief had physically diminished her. They carried with them folders containing their victim impact statements, words they'd agonized over, revised countless times. Words that could never adequately express what had been taken, but that they hoped might help the judge understand. Behind them, rows of Lucas's friends, teachers, and community members filled the prosecution side of the gallery. On the defense side, the Cruz family sat isolated, Haley's mother red-eyed and trembling, her father stone-faced, a few relatives scattered around them. The divide in the courtroom was stark, two families destroyed by one night, sitting mere feet apart, but separated by a chasm of grief and anger that could never be bridged. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff called everyone to order. "All rise." Judge Daniel Klein entered, his black robe seeming more formal, more final than it had during the trial. He settled into his seat and surveyed the packed courtroom with a long, measured look. "Please be seated," he said, and the room rustled with movement before falling into absolute silence. Haley was brought in moments later, handcuffs removed once she reached the defense table. She wore a simple gray dress her mother had brought, her hair pulled back, her face pale and drawn. She looked young, vulnerable, nothing like the grinning girl from the videos. But Judge Klein had seen those videos. He had read the pre-sentence report. He had listened to weeks of testimony. And he knew that the scared teenager in front of him was the same person who had laughed about speed limits being a joke seconds before killing someone. Appearances, he'd learned long ago, could be carefully constructed. Actions told the truth. Judge Klein began by addressing the courtroom at large. "This is a sentencing hearing, but not a continuation of the trial. The defendant has been found guilty by a jury of her peers on all charges. My role today is to determine an appropriate sentence within the bounds of the law. Before I do so, I will hear victim impact statements, and the defendant will be given an opportunity to address the court if she wishes." He looked toward the prosecution table. "Counsel, are the victim impact statements ready?" Prosecutor Karen Chen stood. "Yes, Your Honor, the family of Lucas Rivera would like to speak." The judge nodded. "Please proceed." Lucas's mother stood first, her legs unsteady, and walked slowly to the podium positioned in front of the judge's bench. She set down her papers with trembling hands, looked up at Judge Klein, then turned slightly so she could see both the judge and Haley. When she began to speak, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying through the silent courtroom like a bell. "Your Honor, my name is Maria Rivera, and I am the mother of Lucas Alexander Rivera." She paused, steadying herself. "I have thought about what to say today for months. I've written and rewritten these words dozens of times. But nothing I say will bring my son back. Nothing will undo what happened on that night 6 months ago when someone chose to get behind the wheel drunk and high and reckless and took my baby from me forever." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed forward. Lucas was 17 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He wanted to be an engineer, to build bridges, to create things that would help people. He was accepted to 2 universities with scholarship offers. He tutored younger kids in math, and not for money or for college applications, but because he liked helping people. He was kind, he was careful, he was responsible. Everything a parent hopes their child will be. She looked directly at Haley now, who stared at the table, refusing to meet her eyes. "The night he died, he texted me. He said he'd be home in 10 minutes. I waited for him. I stood at that window, and I waited." Maria's voice grew stronger, fueled by the grief and rage she'd been carrying. "When the police came to my door instead of my son, they told me there had been an accident. But it wasn't an accident. Accidents are unavoidable. What happened to Lucas was the result of dozens of deliberate choices made by the defendant. She chose to drink. She chose to smoke marijuana. She chose to get in her car. She chose to speed, going almost twice the legal limit. She chose to film herself while driving. She chose to mock the traffic laws that exist to keep people like my son safe. And she chose to run a red light at 70 miles an hour, knowing full well what she was doing." Maria's hands gripped the edges of the podium. "And then, after she killed him, after she left my son dying in the street, she complained that he shouldn't have been in the road. She showed no remorse. She smirked in court. She told her lawyer she'd be home by the weekend, as if this were just a minor inconvenience, as if my son's life meant nothing." Tears streamed down Maria's face now, but her voice didn't waver. "I will never see my son graduate high school. I will never watch him walk across a stage to get his college degree. I will never meet the woman he would have married. I never hold the grandchildren he would have given me. I will never hear his laugh again, never get another hug, never get another text message. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone is now marked by his absence. My daughter had to grow up overnight, losing the big brother who protected her and made her feel safe. My husband and I will never be the same people we were before. We are broken in ways that can never be fully healed." She paused, wiping her eyes. The defendant's lawyer talked about her potential, about the life she could live if given a second chance. But what about Lucas's potential? What about the life he could have lived? He doesn't get a second chance. He doesn't get mercy. He got death, and we got a life sentence of grief. Maria looked up at Judge Klein. "Your Honor, I am not asking for vengeance. I am asking for justice. I am asking that the sentence you impose today reflects the value of my son's life, that it sends a message that some actions have consequences that can't be talked away or excused because someone is young. Lucas was young too. His youth didn't save him, so I'm asking that her youth not save her from accountability." She took a shaky breath. "I want her to think about Lucas every single day she's in prison. I want her to remember his name, his face, the future she stole from him. Because I can promise you, we will think about him every single day for the rest of our lives. That is our sentence, and she should carry a sentence that reflects even a fraction of what we've lost." "Thank you." She gathered her papers and walked back to her seat, collapsing into her husband's arms, and her composure finally breaking completely as sobs shook her body. Judge Klein nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Mrs. Rivera. Mr. Rivera, would you like to speak?" Lucas's father stood, walked to the podium, and placed a folder in front of him. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked directly at Haley, who was crying now, quietly, her shoulders shaking. "Miss Cruz," he began, his voice low and controlled, "I taught my son how to drive. I taught him to be careful, to follow the rules, to respect other drivers and pedestrians. I taught him that when you get behind the wheel of a car, you're controlling a machine that can kill, and that comes with enormous responsibility." He paused. "I also taught him that if he followed the rules, if he was careful and responsible, he would be safe, that other drivers would do the same. I lied to him. Not intentionally, but I lied, because you proved that following the rules doesn't keep you safe when someone else decides rules don't matter." David Rivera's voice tightened with emotion. "My son is dead because you wanted likes on a video, because you thought speeding was fun, because you believed you were special, that consequences didn't apply to you. And now my wife cries herself to sleep every night. My daughter has nightmares and panic attacks. And I go to work every day and pretend to be functional when inside I'm screaming because the person who took my son from me got to live when he didn't." He opened the folder and pulled out several pages. "This is a letter of recommendation Lucas's professor wrote for the engineering program he was accepted into. It describes him as exceptionally bright, curious, and committed to using his skills to benefit society. This is a project proposal he was working on for a bridge design that would better serve communities in flood zones. This is a text message he never got to send, telling me he wanted to practice parallel parking this weekend so he'd be ready for his driver's test." His voice broke. "He was excited to learn to drive safely, and you killed him while driving like a maniac." David looked up at Judge Klein. "Your Honor, I'm a practical man. I understand that no sentence will bring Lucas back. But I need to know that the person who did this will be held accountable in a way that matches the severity of what she's done. I need to know that somewhere, somehow, justice exists. Because right now, I don't believe in much of anything anymore." He gathered his papers, nodded once to the judge, and returned to his seat. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of the reporters in the back were wiping their faces. The weight of the Rivera's grief was palpable, suffocating, impossible to ignore. And through it all, Haley sat at the defense table, tears running down her face, finally looking like someone who understood what she had done. But whether it was genuine remorse or just fear of what was coming, no one could quite tell. Judge Klein turned his attention to Marisol. "Young lady, I understand you also have a statement prepared. Would you like to come forward?" Marisol stood slowly, her hands shaking as she clutched a single piece of paper. She walked to the podium, and when she looked up she seemed even smaller, a child forced into an adult situation. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper, but the courtroom was so quiet that every word carried. "My name is Marisol Rivera. Lucas was my big brother. He was my favorite person in the world." She looked down at her paper, then back up, directly at Haley. "He used to help me with my homework even when he had his own. He promised to take me to my first concert next summer. He always saved me the last cookie from the package because he knew I liked them. He made me laugh when I was sad." Her voice strengthened slightly. "And now he's gone. And I don't have anyone to help me with algebra, or save me cookies, or make me laugh when everything feels horrible, which is all the time now." Marisol's eyes filled with tears, but she kept going. "I heard someone say that you deserve a second chance because you're young and you made a mistake. But Luke was young too. He doesn't get a second chance. I don't get my brother back, so I don't think it's fair that you get to have a future when you took his." She folded her paper carefully. "I just wanted you to know that he was real. He was a person, not just someone you hit with your car. He was my brother, and I miss him every single day." She walked back to her seat, and her mother pulled her close, both of them crying together. The image of a teenage girl mourning her brother, having to stand in a courtroom and explain her loss to strangers, was almost unbearable. Several jurors from the trial who had returned to watch the sentencing were openly crying. The emotional toll of the statements had left everyone raw and exposed. Judge Klein took a moment, allowing the courtroom to settle, then turned to the defense table. "Ms. McCruz, you have the right to address the court before I impose sentence. Do you wish to speak?" Haley looked at her attorney, who nodded encouragingly. She stood slowly, wiping her face, and approached the podium. For a long moment she just stood there, looking down, gathering herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. I don't know what to say that could possibly make this better. Nothing I say will bring Lucas back. Nothing I say will take away their pain." She glanced toward the Rivera family, but couldn't hold the look. "I am so sorry for what I did. I know that doesn't mean much now. I know you probably don't believe me, but I am. I'm sorry I drank that night. I'm sorry I got in my car. I'm sorry I was speeding and distracted. I'm sorry I didn't stop at that light. I'm sorry I took Lucas from his family." Haley's voice broke, and she sobbed openly. "I wish I could go back. I wish I could change everything. But I can't. And I have to live with that for the rest of my life. I have to live knowing that I killed someone who was just walking home, someone who had plans and dreams and people who loved him." She looked up at Judge Klein. "I know I was wrong. I know I made terrible choices. I know that what I did was inexcusable. And I know that whatever happens to me today, it's what I deserve. I hope that someday, somehow, the Rivera family can find some peace, even though I know I'm the one who took it from them." She returned to her seat, still crying, and her attorney put a hand on her shoulder. It was, by far, the most remorse she had shown throughout the entire process. But for many in the courtroom, it felt too little, too late, a performance born of desperation rather than genuine understanding. The Rivera family sat unmoved, their faces hard. Words, after all, were cheap. Lucas was still dead. Judge Klein leaned back in his chair, surveying the courtroom one final time before speaking. The moment had arrived, the culmination of months of investigation, trial, and waiting. Every person in that room leaned forward slightly, unconsciously, drawn toward the words that would determine Haley Cruz's future. The judge removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly, deliberately, then put them back on. It was a gesture that seemed to stretch time, making the anticipation almost unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, calm, but carried an authority that demanded absolute attention. "This court has presided over many difficult cases during my time on the bench, cases involving violence, abuse, tragedy in countless forms. But this case has been particularly challenging, not because the facts are in dispute. They are not, but because it requires balancing competing values that our society holds dear: accountability and mercy, justice and redemption, punishment and rehabilitation." The judge continued, his gaze moving between Haley and the Rivera family. "I want to begin by acknowledging the Rivera family's unimaginable loss. Nothing I say or do today will bring Lucas back. No sentence I impose will restore him to your lives. And I recognize that any words I offer about your pain are inadequate. But I want you to know that this court has heard you. Your son mattered. His life had value. His future had promise. And what happened to him was not an accident in any meaningful sense of that word. It was the foreseeable result of a pattern of dangerous, reckless behavior by the defendant. Lucas's mother closed her eyes, fresh tears streaming down her face, while his father squeezed her hand. The judge's acknowledgment of Lucas's humanity, his insistence that this was not an accident, meant more to them than any sentence could. It was validation that their grief was justified, that their son's life had mattered to someone in power. Judge Klein then turned his full attention to Haley. "Ms. Cruz, I have watched you throughout these proceedings. I have read the pre-sentence investigation report. I have reviewed the evidence, including the videos you recorded of yourself engaging in the very behavior that ultimately killed Lucas Rivera. And I have considered carefully the arguments made by your attorney regarding your age, your brain development, your potential for rehabilitation." He paused, and the pause felt heavy with judgment. The law recognizes that young people are different, that their brains are still developing, that they deserve opportunities to learn from mistakes and grow into better versions of themselves. These are important principles, and I do not dismiss them lightly. However, they must be balanced against other equally important principles: that actions have consequences, that victims deserve justice, and that society must be protected from dangerous behavior. The judge's voice took on a harder edge. "What troubles me most about this case is not just what you did that night, horrific as it was. It is the pattern of behavior that led to that night. The speeding tickets your father paid to make disappear. The reckless driving videos you posted for months, mocking traffic laws, bragging about your speed, treating public roads as your personal playground. The warnings from friends that you dismissed. The close calls that you laughed off. You had opportunity after opportunity to change course, to recognize that your behavior was dangerous, not just to yourself, but to everyone around you. And you chose again and again to ignore those opportunities." He gestured toward the evidence table, where a still image from the Ridgeway Run video was displayed. Your own words, recorded seconds before impact, were, "Speed limits are such a joke at night." That statement reveals a mindset that is deeply concerning. Not impulsiveness, not poor judgment in a single moment, but a deliberate, ongoing contempt for the rules designed to keep people safe. Judge Klein continued, his tone growing more severe. "And what is perhaps even more troubling is your behavior after you killed Lucas Rivera. You did not immediately express remorse. You did not break down with grief over what you had done. Instead, according to multiple witnesses and your own recorded statements, you blamed the victim. You complained about being arrested. You treated this courtroom as if it were an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. You smirked. You rolled your eyes. You whispered to your attorney about going home soon." Haley's face flushed with shame as the judge recounted her behavior, each observation a damning indictment. "I watched you, Ms. Cruz. I watched as the Rivera family wept. I watched as they listened to testimony about their son's catastrophic injuries. And I watched you check the clock, sigh with boredom, and show more concern for your own comfort than for the life you had taken." The judge leaned forward. "You spoke today about remorse, about wishing you could go back and change things. And perhaps that is genuine. Perhaps the reality of conviction and imprisonment has finally penetrated your awareness in a way that nothing else could. But I must consider not just what you say today, under these circumstances, but what your actions have consistently shown about who you are. And your actions show someone who has never been held truly accountable for anything. Someone who has learned, through years of getting away with rule-breaking, that consequences are for other people. Someone who believed, right up until the jury returned their verdict, that your youth and your appearance and your attorney's arguments would protect you from facing the full weight of what you had done." The courtroom was absolutely silent, every eye fixed on Judge Klein as he systematically dismantled any hope Haley might have had for leniency. "The defense has argued that your brain is not fully developed, that you should not be judged by adult standards. And it is true that brain development continues into the mid-20s. But Ms. Cruz, you are 17 years old. 17-year-olds across this country and around the world manage to obey traffic laws. They manage to choose not to drink and drive. They manage to understand that running red lights at 70 miles an hour puts lives at risk. Your age does not absolve you of basic moral understanding. It does not erase the fact that you knew intellectually that what you were doing was dangerous. You simply chose to do it anyway because you believed you were special, that bad things happen to other people, not to you. Judge Klein's voice dropped slightly, becoming almost conversational, which somehow made his words more devastating. But bad things do happen, Ms. Cruz. And you are not special. You are a person who made terrible choices, and those choices have consequences. For Lucas Rivera, the consequence was death. For his family, the consequence is a lifetime of grief. And for you, the consequence must be proportionate to the harm you caused. Judge Klein straightened in his chair, his expression resolute. I have considered the sentencing guidelines for the charges of which you have been convicted. I have weighed the aggravating and mitigating factors. The aggravating factors are substantial: extreme speed, intoxication, distraction, running a red light, a pattern of prior reckless behavior, and lack of genuine remorse. The mitigating factors are limited to your age and lack of prior criminal convictions. In balancing these factors and in consideration of the need to protect the public, to hold you accountable, and to send a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated, this court imposes the following sentence. The room seemed to hold its breath as one organism. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. Haley gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The Rivera family sat frozen, barely breathing. On the charge of aggravated vehicular homicide, I sentence you to 25 years in the State Correctional Facility. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. 25 years. Haley's mouth fell open in shock. Her mother let out a wail. The judge continued without pause. On the charge of driving under the influence causing death, I sentence you to an additional 10 years to run consecutively. Consecutive. That meant the sentences would stack, not run concurrently. That meant 35 years total, so far. Haley began to sob, her body shaking. Her attorney put an arm around her shoulders, his own face pale. On the charge of reckless endangerment, I sentence you to 5 years, to run consecutively to the previous sentences. Judge Klein's voice was steady, unwavering. The total sentence is 40 years in the State Correctional Facility, and you will be eligible for parole after serving 85% of that sentence, which amounts to 34 years. Credit for time served will apply. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. 40 years. Haley Cruz, 17 years old, had just been sentenced to 40 years in prison. She would be 57 before she was eligible for parole. The courtroom erupted. Haley collapsed forward onto the defense table, sobbing uncontrollably. Her mother screamed, a raw sound of anguish. Her father sat with his head in his hands. On the other side of the aisle, the Rivera family reacted differently. Maria Rivera closed her eyes and whispered something that might have been a prayer of gratitude. David Rivera nodded slowly, his jaw still clenched, but his eyes wet. Marisol stared at Haley with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and sadness, the complex emotions of someone who had gotten justice but knew it couldn't bring her brother back. Judge Klein raised his gavel and brought it down once, sharply, demanding order. This court is still in session. Please compose yourselves. The noise subsided gradually, though Haley continued to cry, her shoulders heaving. The judge waited until relative quiet returned, then continued. Ms. Cruz, I want you to understand something. When you are released from prison, assuming you serve your minimum sentence, you will be 57 years old. You will have spent more time incarcerated than you have been alive. That is a harsh reality, and it is meant to be. Judge Klein's voice softened slightly, but his words remained firm. However, I also want you to understand that this sentence is not just punishment. It is an opportunity for you to truly reflect on what you have done, an opportunity to gain the empathy and understanding that you have lacked up to this point, an opportunity to become a different person than the one who sat in that car laughing about breaking the law seconds before killing someone. He looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time since the sentencing began, his expression held something other than stern judgment. It held something that might have been compassion, or at least hope. You will leave prison someday, Ms. Cruz, and when you do, you will be older than Lucas Rivera ever got to be. I hope that by then you will have learned to see beyond yourself, to understand that every person in a crosswalk, every driver on the road, every family waiting for their child to come home, is as real as you are. That is the lesson I hope these years teach you, because it is a lesson you fail to learn any other way. The judge's final words were directed not just at Haley, but at the entire courtroom. Let this case serve as a reminder to every young person, every parent, every driver, that choices have consequences, that rules exist for a reason, that a car is not a toy or a prop for social media, but a weapon that can kill when used irresponsibly. And let it serve as a promise to victims and their families that this court will not excuse dangerous behavior simply because the person who engaged in it is young. Youth brings potential, but it also brings responsibility. And when that responsibility is violated in a way that takes a life, its accountability must follow. He raised his gavel one final time. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot, final and irrevocable. Deputies moved quickly to place handcuffs on Haley, who could barely stand, her legs buckling as they led her toward the side door that would take her to processing and then to the state prison where she would spend the next 3.5 decades. As Haley was led away, she turned one last time to look at her parents, her face streaked with tears and mascara, her mouth forming the word "Mom," though no sound came out. Sandra Cruz reached toward her daughter, but the deputies were already moving her through the door. And then she was gone, disappeared into the custody of the state. In that moment, Sandra Cruz understood with terrible clarity that the little girl she had brought home from the hospital 17 years ago, the child she had raised and loved and tried to protect, was gone too. Not dead, but transformed by her own choices into someone who would spend the best years of her life behind bars. On the other side of the aisle, the Rivera family sat very still, processing what had just happened. 40 years. It was more than they had dared to hope for, a sentence that reflected the enormity of their loss. But as Lucas's mother looked down at the photo of her son, still propped beside her, she felt no triumph, just exhaustion, just the weight of a journey that had reached an ending, even though the grief would continue forever. As people began to file out of the courtroom, our reporters rushed toward the exits to file their stories. Spectators whispered and debated whether the sentence was just or excessive, and the Rivera family remained seated, not quite ready to leave. Prosecutor Karen Chen approached them, crouching down to their level. "I know this doesn't bring him back," she said quietly, "but I hope it brings some measure of peace, knowing that justice was served." Maria Rivera looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for fighting for him, for making sure he wasn't forgotten." Chen nodded, her own eyes glistening, then gave them space. Slowly, the family stood, gathered their belongings, and made their way out of the courtroom for the last time. As they stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, blinking against the glare, they were met by a crowd of supporters, of people holding signs with Lucas's name, offering hugs and condolences. It was overwhelming and comforting all at once, this outpouring of support from people who had never met their son, but who recognized the injustice of his death and had demanded accountability alongside them. That evening, the news broke across every major outlet. Teen driver sentenced to 40 years for fatal crash. The viral clips of Haley smirking in court were played again, but now juxtaposed with footage of her sobbing as the sentence was read, the stark contrast showing a transformation born not of genuine understanding, but of consequence finally catching up. Legal analysts debated whether 40 years was appropriate, with some praising Judge Klein for sending a strong message about accountability, and others arguing that such a lengthy sentence for a teenager violated principles of rehabilitation. Online, the reactions were similarly divided, though the majority seemed to support the sentence, pointing to the video evidence, the pattern of behavior, and Haley's lack of remorse as factors that justified the harsh punishment. In their respective homes, two families tried to navigate the aftermath. The Riveras sat together in their living room, the same room where they'd waited for Lucas that final night, and felt something they hadn't felt in months, a small measure of relief. Not happiness, never that, but relief that the system had worked, that their son's life had been valued. Across town, the Cruz family sat in darkness, curtains drawn, phones turned off, trying to process the unimaginable. Their daughter, their baby, and would not walk free again until she was nearly 60 years old. They would be elderly or gone by then. They would miss her entire adult life, all the milestones and moments that parents dream of witnessing. It was a different kind of death, a loss that breathed and existed behind bars, but was no less devastating for its continued existence. And somewhere in a holding cell before her transfer to the state prison, Haley Cruz lay curled on a thin mattress, finally, truly understanding that the rules she had mocked, the consequences she had dismissed, the world she had believed revolved around her, had just taught her the hardest lesson of her life. The smirk was gone. The arrogance was shattered. All that remained was the crushing weight of 40 years stretching ahead, and the ghost of a boy named Lucas Rivera, whose name she would carry like a brand for the rest of her life, whether she wanted to or not. 6 months after the sentencing, the intersection at Ridgeway and Elm looked different. The memorial that had grown organically in the days after Lucas's death had been formalized by the city into a small permanent fixture, a bronze plaque embedded in the sidewalk near the crosswalk, reading, "In memory of Lucas Alexander Rivera, 2007 to 2024. Walk safely." The flowers and candles that had once covered the corner were gone, replaced by this modest but enduring acknowledgement. The traffic light had been reprogrammed, the pedestrian crossing time extended by 5 seconds after community members petitioned the city council. It was a small change, but one that might save lives, or that already had people walking more confidently across an intersection that had once been rushed and dangerous. Cars stopped more consistently at the red light now. Whether it was because drivers had heard about the case, or because police had increased enforcement in the area, or simply because the universe had shifted slightly, it was hard to say. But the intersection that had taken Lucas's life now carried his memory in a way that honored him. The Lucas Rivera Memorial Scholarship had awarded its first recipient that spring, a young woman named Sophia Chen, who planned to study civil engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure. At the award ceremony, Sophia spoke about Lucas, whom she'd never met, but whose story had inspired her to think about engineering as a form of service, a way to protect and connect communities. And Maria and David Rivera presented her with the award, a check and a framed photo of Lucas at his science fair project, and they cried as they hugged this stranger who would carry their son's dream forward. It wasn't replacement, would never be that, but it was purpose. It was a way to ensure that Lucas's name meant more than tragedy, that somewhere in the world bridges would be built because he had existed. The scholarship would continue annually, funded by donations that still trickled in from people who had followed the case and wanted to do something, anything, to honor a boy they'd never known, but whose loss had touched them. The Rivera family had begun the slow, painful process of learning to live with grief. Therapy helped, though some days it felt useless, like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. See, they had joined a support group for families who had lost children to impaired or reckless drivers, and sitting in a circle with other parents who understood without needing explanation had provided a strange comfort. They learned that grief doesn't follow a timeline, that anniversaries and holidays would always be hard, that moving on wasn't really the goal so much as moving forward while carrying the weight. Marisol was doing better in school, her grades slowly climbing back toward where they'd been. She still had bad days, moments where the absence of her brother hit her like a physical blow. But she'd also started drawing again, and her art teacher had noticed that her recent work, though often sad, had a power and depth it hadn't before. Trauma, it seemed, could destroy or deepen. Sometimes it did both. Haley Cruz, now inmate number 47,829 at the State Women's Correctional Facility, was learning what 40 years actually meant. The first months had been the hardest, the shock of harsh reality replacing the comfortable life she'd always known. Shared cells, rigid schedules, constant noise, the loss of privacy and autonomy. She'd been assigned to the general population after evaluation, determined she wasn't a significant security risk, and she'd quickly learned the prison hierarchy, where someone convicted of killing a teenager while drunk and distracted ranked fairly low. Other inmates gave her a hard time, called her names, made her first weeks miserable. But gradually she found a place in the ecosystem. She worked in the prison library, reshelving books, a quiet job that gave her time to think. She'd started taking GED courses even though she'd already finished high school, just to have something to do, something to work toward. And slowly, reluctantly, she'd begun to read books about grief, about accountability, about the victims of crimes like hers. It was painful, forcing herself to see through others' eyes, to sit with the magnitude of what she'd done. But it was also the beginning of something that might, decades from now, resemble genuine remorse. The Cruz family visited once a month, the maximum allowed, sitting across from their daughter in a sterile visiting room where they tried to find things to talk about that weren't just recitations of pain. Sandra brought pictures sometimes, updates about relatives, small pieces of the outside world. She'd aged visibly since the sentencing, her hair more gray than brown now, her face lined with stress. She and her ex-husband had found a fragile truce in their shared grief, the blame and anger they'd initially directed at each other, softening into recognition that they'd both failed, in different ways, to see what was happening until it was too late. They'd started a small advocacy group, partnering with the local high school to give presentations about the real consequences of reckless driving. It was penance, perhaps, or maybe just a way to channel their pain into something that might prevent another family from going through what the Riveras had. They showed the video of Haley's sentencing, their own daughter sobbing as 40 years was pronounced, and they told students bluntly, "This is what happens when you think you're invincible. And this is what it looks like when consequences finally catch up." The viral clips of Haley smirking in court had faded from the algorithm, replaced by newer outrages and tragedies in the endless scroll of content. But they resurfaced occasionally, used in true crime videos and cautionary compilations about entitled defendants and justice served. The comments on those videos were always split. People celebrating the harsh sentence, people arguing it was too harsh, people debating whether 17-year-olds should ever be tried as adults. The case had become a touchstone in broader conversations about juvenile justice, brain development, accountability, and the role of social media in encouraging dangerous behavior. Law schools used it as a teaching tool. Defensive driving courses cited it as an example. And parents across the country watched the videos with their teenage children, using Haley's story as a warning. This could be you. One stupid night, one series of bad choices, and your entire life changes forever. Whether the warnings worked, Whether any individual teen watching decided to drive more carefully because of Lucas and Haley's story was impossible to measure. But the ripples spread outward nonetheless. On the first anniversary of Lucas's death, the Rivera family held a memorial service at the intersection. Hundreds of people showed up, far more than they'd expected. Classmates who'd graduated and moved away, but returned for this. Teachers, neighbors, strangers who'd followed the case and felt compelled to pay respects. They released balloons, which Lucas would have hated because he'd been an environmentalist, but which his mother needed for the symbolism of sending something skyward. They told stories, shared memories, and Maria Rivera spoke again, her voice stronger now than it had been in the courtroom. "My son will never be forgotten," she said, looking out at the crowd. "Not by us, not by this community, and not by the person who took him from us. She has 40 years to remember his name. And when she gets out, if she gets out, I hope she spends the rest of her life making sure no one else makes the choices she made. That's all I ask. That's all I can ask." The crowd applauded, and for a moment, standing at the intersection where her son had died, surrounded by people who cared, Maria felt something close to peace. The story of Haley Cruz and Lucas Rivera didn't have a happy ending, because stories like this don't get happy endings. A teenager was dead, a future erased, a family forever broken. Another teenager was in prison, her life effectively over before it had really begun, her family shattered in a different way. The only satisfaction, if it could be called that, was that the system had worked. That evidence had been gathered, a trial had been held, a jury had deliberated, and a judge had imposed a sentence that reflected the gravity of the crime. That accountability had been enforced, that the smirk had been wiped away, that the message had been sent. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be walked back. Actions have consequences. Lives have value. And justice, imperfect and incomplete as it always is, still matters. In a world where so many crimes go unpunished, where so many victims are forgotten, where the powerful and privileged so often escape accountability, had this case stood as a counterexample, as proof that sometimes the system works, that sometimes the gavel falls exactly where it should. Years from now, when Haley Cruz is middle-aged and her hair is streaked with gray, she'll sit in a parole hearing and be asked about the crime that brought her there. And she'll have to say the name Lucas Rivera. She'll have to acknowledge what she took. And maybe, by then, after decades of carrying that weight, she'll have learned the lesson Judge Klein hoped she would learn. Maybe she'll understand that the boy in the crosswalk was as real as she is, that his dreams mattered as much as hers, that his family's pain is carved in stone while hers is measured in years she can eventually outlive. Maybe. Or maybe she'll still be the same person she was at 17, just older. The fundamental inability to see beyond herself unchanged by time and punishment. Only the decades ahead will tell. But for the Rivera family, it doesn't matter. Lucas will still be gone. The empty chair will still be empty. The future he should have had will still be nothing but painful imagination. And they will continue to live with their life sentence of grief, while somewhere behind bars, the person who caused it serves hers. That's not justice in any complete sense. But it's the only justice this broken world can offer. And sometimes, in stories like this, that has to be enough.